Some damage does not show on the body. It lives in the mind, in the way you expect the worst before anything has even happened, in the way one old memory can still change your mood in seconds, in the way you smile in front of people, yet carry exhaustion no one can see. The outside may look calm, but inside, many people are fighting battles that never fully end. Not because they are broken, but because pain repeated long enough begins to feel normal. Most people were never taught how to heal the inner world. They were taught how to survive, how to keep moving, how to stay useful, how to hide their heaviness and call it strength. So they keep going with a tired mind, a restless heart, and thoughts that never seem to stop. They try to fix deep wounds with distraction. They try to silence inner chaos with more noise. But the more the mind is ignored, the louder it becomes. The Stoics understood something that still matters now. They knew that suffering grows when the mind keeps arguing with what has already happened. They knew that peace begins when you stop feeding every fearful thought, every old regret, every painful story that keeps asking for your attention. They taught that the mind can be trained, that inner damage does not have to become your identity, that even after years of mental weight, a person can begin again through calm awareness, honest reflection, and disciplined peace. Tonight, this is your space to begin that return. 4 hours to loosen the grip of old thoughts. 4 hours to sit with wisdom that clears what pain has clouded. 4 hours to quiet the noise, soften the pressure, and give the mind a different direction. Not by force, but by truth. Not by pretending nothing hurt, but by finally learning how not to carry it forever. And as the mind begins to slow down, something unusual starts to reveal itself. Beneath the noise, beneath the endless thinking, there is a pattern most people never question. A quiet attachment to the very pain they say they want to escape. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because it has become familiar. And what is familiar often feels safer than the unknown, even when it hurts. There is a strange comfort in pain that has been carried for a long time. It becomes part of how you understand yourself. The mind starts to return to it without being asked. Old memories replay on their own. Old emotions rise without warning. And even when life is calm, the mind searches for something to worry about, as if peace itself feels unnatural. This is not weakness. It is conditioning. A quiet truth begins to surface. Some of the suffering you carry is no longer coming from the outside. It is being recreated inside, again and again, by a mind that has grown used to certain patterns. Pain becomes a habit. Not a choice at first, but something repeated so often that it starts to feel like part of who you are. The mind clings to what it knows, even when what it knows is heavy. You may notice how certain thoughts return in the same form, the same regret, the same anger, the same feeling of being wronged or misunderstood. It plays like a familiar song, and without realizing it, the mind keeps pressing play. Not because it wants to suffer, but because it has learned that this is what it does. This is how it stays active. This is how it stays occupied. There is also a deeper layer. Pain can quietly become a form of identity. When something has hurt you deeply, it leaves a mark. Over time, that mark can turn into a story about what happened, about who was responsible, about what it meant. And slowly, that story becomes part of how you see yourself. Letting go of the pain can begin to feel like letting go of a part of your identity, and the mind resists that. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the mind does not only react to pain, it can also become attached to it. Not in a dramatic way, but in subtle habits. They taught that suffering continues when we keep feeding it with attention. Every time the mind revisits the same wound without purpose, It strengthens the connection to it. It deepens the groove. It makes the return easier next time. But there is a way to loosen this hold. It begins with noticing. Noticing without reacting. Noticing without judging. When a painful thought appears, instead of following it, instead of building on it, you simply see it. You acknowledge that it is there, but you do not give it more meaning than it already has. This is where the bond begins to weaken. The Stoics practiced something simple but powerful. They separated what happens from what they add to it. The event itself is one thing. The story the mind builds around it is another. Most of the suffering comes not from the event, but from the repeated telling of the story in the mind. The mind keeps explaining, keeps analyzing, keeps reliving, and in doing so, it keeps the pain alive. When you begin to see this, something shifts. You start to understand that you are not required to continue the story. The memory may exist, but the constant replay is optional. The feeling may arise, but the attachment to it is something that can be softened. This does not happen by force. It happens through awareness and quiet discipline. There is also a release that comes from accepting that the past does not need to be solved again. Many people hold on to pain because they are still trying to fix what already happened. They replay situations hoping for a different outcome, a better response, a clearer understanding. But the Stoics remind us that the past is not a place where action can occur. It is only a place where memory lives. By letting go of the need to correct the past, the mind begins to free itself from the cycle. The energy that was used to maintain the suffering can now be redirected, not into suppression, not into denial, but into presence, into what is happening now rather than what has already ended. Over time, this creates a new pattern. The mind learns that it does not have to return to pain every time it feels empty or uncertain. It learns that stillness is not dangerous, that peace is not something to avoid, that it is safe to exist without carrying the weight of old emotions at all times. And slowly, without force, the attachment begins to fade. The thoughts lose their urgency. The memories lose their sharpness, not because they disappear, but because the mind is no longer feeding them in the same way. What once felt like a constant presence becomes something distant, something that no longer controls your inner state. This is the beginning of freedom. Not the removal of all pain, but the removal of the need to hold on to it. The understanding that suffering does not have to be repeated to be acknowledged, and that healing is not about erasing the past, but about ending the habit of reliving it. And as that attachment begins to loosen, another layer quietly reveals itself. If the mind is no longer clinging to pain on purpose, then why does it keep returning to it on its own? Why do certain moments replay without warning, even when you are trying to move forward? This is where a deeper understanding is needed. Because the repetition is not random. It follows a pattern the mind has learned over time. There is something almost automatic about it. A memory surfaces, a feeling follows, and before you notice, the mind is already deep inside an old scene. It does not ask for permission. It does not wait for the right moment. It simply returns to what hurt, as if it has unfinished business there. The truth is simple, but often ignored. The mind repeats what has not been fully understood. Not understood in a logical way, but in an emotional sense. When something painful happens, the body feels it immediately. The mind reacts, tries to protect, tries to make sense of it. But in many cases, the experience is too intense, too sudden, or too confusing to be processed at that moment. So it remains open. And what is left open, the mind keeps revisiting. It is not trying to torture you, it is trying to resolve something, like a conversation that was never finished, like a question that was never answered, like a moment that never felt complete. The repetition is the mind's way of saying, there is still something here that needs attention. This is why certain thoughts come back in the same form, not because you are weak, but because the mind has not found closure within itself. It keeps going back, hoping that this time it will understand, that this time it will feel different, that this time it will finally settle. But without awareness, the opposite happens. Each replay strengthens the emotional charge. The mind does not resolve the pain, it deepens it. The same thoughts, the same reactions, the same feelings repeat until they become a loop that feels real, present, and active, even though the event itself is long gone. The Stoics observed this pattern long before modern psychology gave it a name. They saw that the mind often becomes trapped, not by what happened, but by how it continues to interpret what happened. The event passes, but the interpretation remains active, and that interpretation is what keeps the suffering alive. What they practiced was a form of interruption, not by force, but through awareness. When a thought appears, instead of following it automatically, they paused. They observed it as something separate from themselves. They recognized that a thought is not a command. It is simply a mental event passing through the mind. This creates a small but powerful space, a space where you are no longer inside the loop, but looking at it. And in that space, something changes. The thought loses a bit of its control. It no longer pulls you as strongly as before. There is also another layer to this repetition. The mind prefers what is familiar, even when it is painful. If you have spent years thinking in a certain way, feeling in a certain pattern, reacting in a certain rhythm, the mind begins to see that as normal. So when something different appears, something calm, something quiet, it can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. So the mind returns to what it knows, not because it is better, but because it is known. Breaking this pattern requires something simple, but not easy. Consistent awareness, noticing the moment the loop begins, not at the end when the mind is already deep inside the story, but at the beginning. The first thought, the first shift in feeling, that is where the interruption is most powerful. When you catch it early, you can choose not to continue. Not by pushing it away, but by not adding to it. You let the thought exist without building on it. You allow the feeling to rise without creating a story around it. This weakens the loop over time. Another important shift is understanding that closure does not come from replaying the past. It comes from accepting that the past does not need to be replayed at all. The mind often believes that more thinking will lead to resolution, but in many cases, more thinking only leads to more repetition. The Stoics practiced acceptance not as resignation, but as clarity. They saw clearly what had already happened, and they stopped trying to change it in their minds. This does not mean ignoring emotions. It means allowing them to exist without turning them into endless stories. There is also a form of discipline involved, the discipline of where you place your attention. Every time the mind starts to return to old pain, you have a choice, to follow it, or to gently bring your attention back to the present. Not in a harsh way, but in a steady, patient way. Over time, this changes the pattern. The mind learns that it does not have to return to the same place every time. It learns that there are other directions it can take, and slowly the old loops begin to lose their strength. What once felt automatic becomes something you can see. What once felt uncontrollable becomes something you can guide. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually. And in that gradual shift, something important happens. The mind starts to rest, not because everything is solved, but because it is no longer trapped in constant repetition. It begins to move forward, not by forgetting the past, but by no longer living inside it. And as those loops begin to slow down, something even more subtle starts to come into focus. Beneath the repeated thoughts, beneath the old memories, there is a voice, a constant voice, one that has been speaking to you for years without being questioned. And the way it speaks changes everything. It does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it sounds like logic. Sometimes it even feels like truth. But if you listen closely, you may notice something uncomfortable. The tone is harsh. The judgment is constant. The patience is gone. And over time, this voice begins to shape how you see yourself. There is a kind of damage that does not come from the outside world. It comes from the way you speak to yourself when no one is around. A quiet form of violence. Not physical, not visible, but deeply felt. It shows up in the way you replay your mistakes, in the way you call yourself weak for feeling tired, in the way you expect perfection but offer yourself no understanding when you fall short. And the most dangerous part is how normal it begins to feel. Many people believe that being hard on themselves is necessary. That harshness creates discipline. That pressure leads to growth. But what often happens is the opposite. The mind becomes tense. The body carries that tension. And instead of moving forward with clarity, you move with fear of making another mistake. This kind of inner dialogue does not build strength. It erodes it slowly. Every time you speak to yourself with cruelty, the mind listens. It does not argue back. It absorbs the tone, the message, the emotion behind it. And over time, it starts to believe it. Not because it is true, but because it is repeated. You may notice how quickly the mind turns against you after something small. A mistake, a missed opportunity, a moment of weakness. Instead of learning from it, the mind attacks. It labels, it exaggerates. It turns a single moment into a statement about who you are. This is how self-trust begins to break. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the mind can either be a place of order or a place of chaos. And that order does not come from force. It comes from discipline in how you think. Not just what you think, but how you respond to your own thoughts. They practiced a different approach. When something went wrong, they did not rush to insult themselves. They paused. They looked at the situation as it was. They separated the action from the identity. A mistake was seen as an event, not a definition. This creates a powerful shift. You begin to correct without attacking. You begin to improve without tearing yourself down. There is also a deeper layer to this harsh inner voice. In many cases, it was learned, picked up over time from environments where criticism was common, where understanding was limited, where mistakes were not met with patience, and without realizing it, that external voice becomes internal. It continues even when those environments are gone. But what is learned can also be unlearned. The first step is awareness, noticing how you speak to yourself in difficult moments, noticing the tone, the words, the pressure, seeing it clearly without trying to justify it. This alone begins to create distance. The next step is choice. Not forcing positivity, not pretending everything is fine, but choosing a different response. A response that is firm but not cruel, honest but not destructive. Instead of saying, "I always mess things up," you begin to say, "That did not go well, but it can be improved." The difference may seem small, but the effect is deep. One destroys, the other builds. The Stoics believed in inner order, a state where the mind is steady, where reactions are measured, where thoughts are guided with intention. This does not mean being soft or avoiding responsibility. It means being precise, addressing what needs to be corrected without adding unnecessary suffering. There is strength in calm correction. Over time, this changes the relationship you have with yourself. The mind becomes less defensive. The tension begins to ease. You no longer feel like you are constantly being judged from within. Instead, there is a sense of guidance, a sense that even when things go wrong, you are still on your own side. This builds trust. And with trust, the mind becomes more stable. It does not react as sharply. It does not fall as deeply into negativity. It begins to recover faster, to adjust more easily, to move forward without carrying the same weight. The harsh voice does not disappear overnight. It may still appear, especially in moments of stress or pressure. But now it is seen for what it is, a pattern, not a truth, a habit, not a command. And when it appears, you do not follow it blindly. You recognize it. You pause. You respond differently. This is where discipline becomes quiet power, not loud, not forceful, but steady. The kind of discipline that shapes the inner world without creating more damage. And slowly, the violence fades. What remains is a mind that is still honest, still aware, but no longer at war with itself. And as that harsh voice begins to lose its grip, another truth quietly begins to rise. If the way you speak to yourself can be changed, then what else inside you is not as fixed as it once felt? What if the thoughts that disturb you are not you at all? What if the storm you feel is something you are experiencing, not something you are? There is a moment many people never reach. A moment where they begin to see their own mind from a distance, not trapped inside every thought, not carried away by every emotion, but simply aware, watching, present. And in that moment, something shifts. The chaos is still there, but it no longer feels like identity. There is a quiet relief in realizing that not everything happening inside you belongs to who you are. Thoughts come and go without permission. Emotions rise without warning. One moment you feel calm, the next moment your mind is racing, replaying something, worrying about something, reacting to something that is not even happening anymore. And it feels personal. It feels like something is wrong with you. But the Stoics saw this differently. They understood that the mind produces activity just as the body produces breath. Thoughts are not always chosen. Feelings are not always controlled. But what matters is not that they appear. What matters is what you do when they do. Most people collapse into their thoughts. A negative idea appears, and it becomes their reality. A wave of anxiety rises, and it defines the moment. There is no space between what is happening inside and who they believe they are. The thought says, "You are not enough," and without question, it becomes truth. But there is another way to live. The Stoics practiced separation, not separation from life, but separation within the mind. They trained themselves to see thoughts as events, not identities, as passing movements, not permanent truths. This creates a gap, a small space between you and what is happening inside you. And in that space, freedom begins. When a thought appears, instead of saying, "This is me," you begin to see, "This is something happening in my mind." The difference is quiet, but powerful. It changes the relationship completely. You are no longer inside the storm. You are observing it. This does not remove the thought. It does not silence the emotion immediately, but it changes your position. You are no longer being pulled in every direction. You are steady, even while the mind is active. There is something important to understand here. The mind can create noise without meaning. Just because a thought is loud does not make it true. Just because an emotion is intense does not mean it must be followed. Many people spend years reacting to everything that arises, never questioning it, never stepping back. This is where suffering grows. The Stoics believed that clarity comes from seeing things as they are, not as they feel in the moment. And to do that, you must step out of the immediate reaction. You must allow the thought to exist without immediately agreeing with it or fighting it. This takes practice. At first it feels strange. The mind is used to quick reactions. It wants to analyze, to judge, to respond immediately. But when you begin to pause to simply observe, something changes. The thought passes faster. The emotion softens sooner. The intensity begins to lose its hold. There is also a deeper calm that comes from this separation. When you no longer identify with every internal movement, you stop taking everything personally. A moment of anxiety does not mean you are weak. A negative thought does not mean you are broken. It is simply something passing through, like clouds moving across the sky. The sky is not the clouds. The sky remains steady, even when the clouds are heavy, even when the storm is strong. In the same way, there is a part of you that remains steady beneath everything that moves through your mind. And the more you return to that place, the more stable you become. This does not mean you ignore your thoughts or emotions. It means you relate to them differently. You listen without being controlled. You notice without becoming overwhelmed. You respond instead of reacting. Over time, this creates a quiet strength, a kind of inner balance that is not easily shaken. The same thoughts may still appear, the same emotions may still rise, but they do not define your state in the same way. You begin to see them as temporary. This is one of the most freeing shifts a person can experience. The realization that you are not the chaos inside you, that the mind can be loud without you needing to follow it, that emotions can rise without you needing to become them. And slowly the storm loses its power, not because it disappears, but because you are no longer standing in the middle of it without awareness. You have stepped back. You have created space. And in that space, there is something that was always there: stillness. A stillness that does not depend on perfect thoughts or constant calm. A stillness that exists even when the mind is active. A stillness that reminds you that beneath everything that comes and goes, you remain untouched. And as that distance becomes clearer, another pattern begins to reveal itself. If you are not your thoughts, then why do they still have so much power over how you feel? Why can a single idea, passing through the mind for just a moment, change your entire mood, your energy, even your sense of self? The answer is simple, but often overlooked. It is not the thought itself that causes the damage. It is the belief in the thought. There is a quiet habit most people carry without noticing. Every thought that appears is treated as if it must be true. It arrives, and it is accepted instantly. No pause, no question, no distance. And from that belief, emotion follows. A thought says something is wrong, and the body tightens. A thought suggests failure, and the mind begins to sink. A thought brings up fear, and suddenly the future feels dangerous. It all happens so quickly that it feels real. It feels certain. But what if the thought was never accurate to begin with? The mind is constantly generating ideas, interpretations, assumptions. Some are useful, many are not. Some are based on reality. Many are based on fear, memory, or habit. Yet without awareness, they are all treated the same, all given equal weight, all believed without question. This is where suffering quietly grows. When every thought is taken as truth, the mind becomes unstable. It moves up and down depending on whatever appears next. There is no grounding, no filter, no clarity. One moment you feel confident, the next moment you feel doubt, simply because a different thought has taken control. It becomes exhausting. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the mind does not need to believe everything it produces. They practiced something deeper than positive thinking. They practiced examination, a calm, steady way of looking at thoughts before accepting them. When a thought appeared, they did not rush to follow it. They paused. They asked simple questions. Is this true? Is this useful? Is this within my control? And in that pause, something changed. The automatic belief was interrupted. This is where sanity begins to return. Instead of being pulled in every direction, the mind becomes more selective. It does not accept every idea as fact. It begins to see thoughts as suggestions, not commands. And once you see that, the emotional reaction starts to weaken. There is also something important to understand about how thoughts are formed. Many of them are not based on the present moment. They are shaped by past experiences, by fears, by old patterns. So when a thought appears, it is often a reflection of what has already happened, not what is happening now. Yet it feels immediate. It feels real. For example, a single mistake can trigger a thought that says, "You always fail." Not because it is true, but because the mind is connecting it to older experiences. It builds a story quickly, without checking the facts. And when that story is believed, the emotional weight follows. This is how small moments become heavy. The Stoics trained themselves to break this chain. They did not allow one thought to grow into a full story without examination. They stayed close to what is real, what is present, what can actually be known. This kept the mind grounded. There is also a quiet freedom in realizing that not every thought deserves your attention. You do not need to fight every negative idea. You do not need to replace it with something positive. Sometimes, the most powerful response is to simply not engage, to let the thought pass without building on it. This reduces the emotional cost immediately, because the suffering does not come from the first thought. It comes from the thoughts that follow, the analysis, the repetition, the story that keeps expanding. When you stop feeding that process, the intensity fades. It may not disappear instantly, but it loses strength. Over time, this changes the entire inner experience. The mind becomes calmer, not because it has no thoughts, but because it is no longer controlled by them. There is more space, more clarity, more stability. You begin to notice that thoughts come and go like movement in the background. Some are useful and deserve attention. Others are simply noise. And the more you practice this awareness, the easier it becomes to tell the difference. This is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming accurate, feeling what is real, not what is imagined, responding to what is happening, not what the mind assumes. And with that accuracy, the mind begins to settle. There is less confusion, less unnecessary pressure, less internal conflict. You are no longer reacting to every idea that appears. You are choosing what to engage with, and in that choice, there is control. A quiet, steady control that does not come from force, but from understanding. And as this understanding deepens, something begins to shift. The mind no longer feels like a place you have to defend yourself from. It becomes a place you can trust. Not because it is always right, but because you no longer believe everything it says. And as that clarity begins to settle, another pattern quietly comes into view. Even when you stop believing every thought, something still pulls you backward. Certain memories return with a force that feels fresh, as if time has not passed at all. A moment from years ago can still tighten your chest, still change your mood, still bring back a version of you that you thought you had left behind. There is a quiet pain in realizing that the past is not always past. Some memories do not fade on their own. They stay active, waiting for a small trigger, a word, a place, a silence, and suddenly the mind opens a door you did not intend to revisit. What hurts is not just the memory itself, but how alive it feels when it returns. This is how old wounds keep reopening. The mind holds onto moments that were never fully released. Not because it wants to suffer, but because something inside still feels unfinished. A humiliation that was never processed, a loss that was never accepted, a regret that was never understood. These experiences leave an imprint, and without awareness, the mind keeps returning to them, trying to resolve something that cannot be changed. It is like touching the same bruise over and over, hoping that this time it will not hurt. There is also a deeper reason why certain memories stay strong. The mind gives more weight to emotional experiences, especially painful ones. It stores them with intensity as a form of protection. It believes that by remembering clearly, it can prevent the same pain from happening again. But instead of protecting you, it keeps you connected to the pain. Every time the memory is replayed, the body responds as if it is happening again. The same tension, the same emotion, the same discomfort. The mind does not always distinguish between past and present when the memory is strong enough, and so what has already ended continues to live inside you. The Stoics understood this trap. They knew that memory itself is not the problem. It is the way the mind returns to it, the way it holds on to it, the way it keeps feeding it with attention and emotion. They taught that the past has no power unless it is given power in the present. This is where release begins. Not by trying to erase the memory, not by pretending it did not happen, but by changing the relationship with it, seeing it clearly without adding to it, allowing it to exist without reopening the wound every time it appears. There is a difference between remembering and reliving. Remembering is calm. It is distant. It holds the facts without pulling you back into the emotion. Reliving is intense. It brings the past into the present. It makes the body react, the mind tighten, the emotion rise again. The goal is not to forget. The goal is to remember without suffering. This requires a form of acceptance that is often misunderstood. Not acceptance as approval, not acceptance as weakness, but acceptance as clarity. The clear recognition that what happened has already happened, that it cannot be undone, corrected, or changed by revisiting it. The Stoics practiced this by bringing their attention back to what is within their control, the present moment, their actions, their response. They refused to spend energy trying to reshape something that no longer exists outside their memory. This breaks the cycle. There is also a quiet discipline in not engaging with the emotional pull of the memory. When it appears, you notice it, you acknowledge it, but you do not follow it deeper. You do not build a story around it. You do not let it expand. You let it pass. At first, this feels unnatural. The mind is used to diving into the memory, analyzing it, feeling it again. But with practice, a new pattern forms. The memory still appears, but it no longer takes over. It becomes lighter, less intense, less frequent. This is what clean release looks like. Not dramatic, not forced, just a gradual softening, a loosening of the grip that the past once had on you, a shift from carrying the memory to simply knowing it happened. There is also something powerful in choosing not to define yourself by what you remember. Many people carry their past as a permanent label, as proof of who they are. But the Stoics saw identity differently. They believed that who you are is shaped by how you live now, not by what happened before. This creates space. Space to move forward without dragging old weight. Space to experience life without constant reference to past pain. Space to exist without reopening the same wounds again and again. And slowly, something changes. The memories lose their sharpness. The emotional charge fades. What once felt heavy becomes distant, not erased, not denied, but no longer controlling your inner state. This is the quiet freedom of release, the understanding that the past can exist without ruling the present. That memory can remain without becoming a source of ongoing suffering, and that healing is not about forgetting, but about no longer reopening what has already ended. And as those memories begin to loosen their hold, something even more subtle starts to reveal itself. Not just the memories that appear on their own, but the ones you return to on purpose. The quiet habit of replaying what hurt, not once, but over and over again, in silence. There is a kind of suffering that no one sees. It does not happen in public. It does not need a trigger. It happens in the quiet moments, when the mind has nothing to do, and it begins to wander back to what went wrong. A conversation that ended badly, a betrayal that still feels unfinished, a failure that never sat well, and without realizing it, the mind begins to rehearse the pain. It goes over the same details again. What was said, what should have been said, what could have been done differently. It builds new versions of the same moment, trying to rewrite something that cannot be changed. And each time it does this, the emotion returns with it. This is not reflection. This is repetition. Reflection brings understanding. It moves you forward. It extracts meaning and then lets go. Rehearsing does the opposite. It keeps you in the same place. It feeds the same emotion without resolution. It turns a past event into a present experience again and again. And the longer this continues, the deeper it becomes. The mind starts to treat these rehearsals as something necessary, as if going over the pain will somehow fix it, prepare you, protect you. But in reality, it does none of these things. It only keeps the wound active. It keeps the feeling alive long after the event has passed. This is how years of quiet suffering are created. No one else sees it, no one else hears it. But inside, the same scenes are playing, the same emotions are rising, the same tension is building, and over time it becomes exhausting, not because of what happened, but because of how often it is repeated. The Stoics saw this as a misuse of the mind. They understood that the mind is meant to guide action in the present, not to endlessly revisit what cannot be changed. They believed that attention is a limited resource, and where it is placed determines the quality of your inner life. When attention is constantly placed on past pain, the mind becomes trapped there. What they practiced instead was redirection, not avoidance, not suppression, but a deliberate shift of focus. When the mind began to drift into old rehearsals, they did not follow it. They noticed it, and then they guided their attention back to what was useful, what was real, what was within their control. This is not easy at first. The pull of old pain can be strong. It feels familiar. It feels important. It feels like something that still needs to be solved. But with awareness, you begin to see that the rehearsal is not solving anything. It is simply repeating. And once you see that clearly, the need to continue weakens. There is also something important to understand about these silent rehearsals. They often come from a desire for control, a desire to go back and change the outcome, to say the right thing, to avoid the mistake, to prevent the pain. But the Stoics remind us of something simple and difficult at the same time. The past cannot be controlled. No amount of thinking will change what has already happened. No amount of replaying will create a different result. And once this is accepted fully, not just intellectually but emotionally, something begins to release. The mind no longer feels the need to keep returning. There is also a shift that happens when you begin to use the mind for what it is meant for. Not for endless analysis of the past, but for clear action in the present. When your attention is placed on what you can do now, what you can build, what you can improve, the old rehearsals lose their space. They have less room to appear. This is where freedom begins to grow, not by removing all thoughts of the past, but by changing how much time and energy you give them, by choosing not to engage in the same silent patterns that have kept the pain alive. Over time, the rehearsals become less frequent. The urge to revisit them weakens. The mind finds new paths, new directions, new ways to use its energy. And slowly, the inner space becomes quieter, not empty, but calm, not forced, but natural. A place where thoughts can come and go without pulling you back into old scenes. A place where the past exists, but no longer demands constant attention. This is the end of silent torture. The understanding that you do not have to keep reliving what has already happened, that you are not required to rehearse your pain to prove that it mattered, and that the mind, when guided with awareness, can finally rest from repeating what it was never meant to carry this long. And as those silent rehearsals begin to fade, another source of unrest quietly steps forward, not from the past this time, but from the future. A future that has not happened, yet somehow feels real enough to disturb your peace in the present. There is a certain kind of fear that does not come from reality. It comes from imagination. The mind begins to create possibilities, small at first, a simple what if, but then it grows. What if things go wrong? What if something is lost? What if something fails? And before you notice, the mind has built a full picture of something that has not even happened, and the body reacts as if it already has. This is how peace begins to slip away. Not because something is happening now, but because the mind is living in a version of the future that exists only in thought. The more detailed the imagination becomes, the more convincing it feels. The more convincing it feels, the more the mind believes it. And once it is believed, the emotion follows. There is a quiet danger in this. The mind is incredibly creative. It can build entire scenarios in seconds. It can take one small concern and expand it into something overwhelming. It can turn uncertainty into certainty and possibility into fear. Without control, this imagination becomes a source of constant disturbance. You may notice how quickly the mind jumps ahead. One small issue appears, and suddenly it connects to 10 others. A simple delay becomes a complete failure. A minor mistake becomes a permanent consequence. The mind fills in the gaps with worst-case outcomes, and then reacts to those outcomes as if they are real. This is not reality. This is projection. The Stoics understood that much of human suffering comes not from what is happening, but from what is imagined. They saw that the mind, when left unchecked, tends to move toward fear rather than balance. It tries to protect, but in doing so, it creates unnecessary stress. What they practiced was a return to what is real. When the mind began to drift into imagined futures, they brought it back, not by force, but through reasoning. They asked simple, grounding questions. Is this happening now? Is there evidence for this fear? What is actually within my control at this moment? These questions do something important. They break the illusion. Instead of following the imagined scenario, the mind is pulled back to the present, back to what can be seen, what can be known, what can be acted upon. And in that return, the intensity begins to fade. There is also a discipline in not allowing every possibility to grow unchecked. Not every thought deserves to be explored. Not every fear needs to be expanded. Sometimes the most rational response is to stop the thought before it builds, not by suppressing it, but by refusing to add to it. This is where peace begins to return. When the mind is no longer allowed to turn every uncertainty into a threat, it becomes calmer. It stops jumping ahead constantly. It stays closer to what is actually happening. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. Most of the things the mind fears never happen, and even when something difficult does occur, it is rarely as overwhelming as the imagined version. The Stoics trained themselves to face reality as it is, not as the mind exaggerates it. They prepared for challenges, but they did not live inside them before they arrived. They kept their attention where it mattered, in the present, where action is possible. This creates a kind of stability. The future is no longer something to fear constantly. It becomes something that will be handled when it arrives. The mind stops trying to control what cannot be controlled and begins to focus on what can be done now. And with that shift, something changes. The constant tension begins to ease. The need to predict every outcome fades. The mind becomes less reactive, less restless, less driven by imagined threats. There is more space to breathe, to think clearly, to experience the present without being pulled into scenarios that do not exist. Space to respond to life as it happens, rather than as the mind fears it might happen. And slowly, peace returns. Not because the future is certain, but because the mind is no longer trying to live in it ahead of time. Not because all problems are solved, but because they are no longer being created in advance. This is the quiet strength of Stoic reasoning. The ability to see clearly what is real, to let go of what is imagined, and to remain steady in the only place where life is actually happening. Here, now. And as the mind begins to return to the present, something even more delicate comes into focus. You are no longer lost in imagined futures, no longer trapped in repeated past scenes. Yet there are still moments when pain feels overwhelming. Not because it is constant, but because when it appears, it feels like it takes over everything. This is where a quiet confusion often happens. The difference between feeling pain and becoming it. There is nothing unnatural about pain. It is part of being human. Loss, disappointment, rejection, failure. These experiences carry weight. They are felt deeply, and they should be. The Stoics never denied this. They did not try to erase emotion or pretend that nothing hurts. But they understood something important. Pain is something you experience. It is not something you are. The problem begins when that line disappears. A difficult moment happens, and the feeling rises. At first, it is just an emotion. But then the mind adds to it. It creates meaning around it. It begins to say, "This is who I am now." And slowly, without noticing, the feeling turns into identity. You are no longer someone experiencing sadness. You become a sad person. You are no longer someone facing failure. You become a failure. The emotion, which was meant to pass, becomes something you carry as a permanent description of yourself. This is where suffering deepens. Because when pain becomes identity, it does not leave easily. It stays. It repeats. It shapes how you see everything. Every new experience is filtered through it. Every thought is colored by it. And over time, it becomes harder to separate yourself from what you feel. This is not because the pain is stronger than you. It is because the mind has merged with it. The Stoics practiced a different way of relating to emotion. They allowed themselves to feel, but they did not allow the feeling to define them. They created a quiet space between the experience and the self, a space where the emotion could exist without becoming identity. This is what emotional detachment truly means. Not coldness, not numbness, not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to feel fully without losing yourself inside the feeling, to recognize that something is painful while also knowing that it does not describe who you are. There is strength in this clarity. When sadness appears, you notice it, you allow it. You do not fight it or push it away. But you also do not say, "This is me." You say, "This is something I am feeling." The difference is small in words, but powerful in effect. It keeps the emotion moving. Pain, when not held too tightly, naturally shifts. It rises, it stays for a moment, and then it begins to fade. But when it is turned into identity, it becomes fixed. It stops moving. It stays longer than it needs to. This is why some people carry the same emotional weight for years. not because the original pain is still happening, but because the identity built around it is still active. The mind keeps reinforcing it, keeps returning to it, keeps seeing everything through it. The Stoics worked to break this pattern. They reminded themselves daily that they are not their passing states, that emotions come and go, but the self remains steady beneath them. They practiced observing their feelings without attaching permanent meaning to them. This creates freedom. You are able to experience life more fully without being trapped by each emotional wave. You can feel deeply, but you are not carried away. You can face difficulty, but you are not defined by it. There is also a quiet confidence that grows from this, a sense that no matter what arises inside you, you can remain grounded. Not untouched, but stable. Not distant, but clear. And this clarity changes everything. It allows you to move through pain without becoming stuck in it, to learn from it without building your identity around it, to carry wisdom forward without carrying the weight. Over time, the relationship with emotion becomes lighter, not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer merging with every feeling that appears. You are standing beside it, aware, present, steady. And in that position, something begins to return. A sense of self that is not defined by past hurt. A sense of calm that is not dependent on constant comfort. A sense of strength that does not need to prove itself. This is the quiet power of emotional detachment. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of awareness. The understanding that pain can visit without becoming your home, and that no matter how intense a moment feels, it does not have to become who you are. And as that separation becomes stronger, another hidden pattern begins to surface. Even when you are no longer trapped in every thought, even when you no longer become every emotion, there is still something subtle shaping your inner state, something that does not come from pain directly, but from people. The need to be approved. It does not always appear loudly. It moves quietly, almost invisibly, in the way you adjust your words so others will agree, in the way you hesitate before acting, wondering how it will be received, in the way a single negative reaction can stay with you longer than 100 positive ones. And slowly, without realizing it, your peace begins to depend on how others respond to you. This is where the damage begins. When your sense of worth is tied to approval, your mind becomes unstable, not because you are weak, but because you are placing your balance in something you cannot control. People change, opinions shift. What pleases one person may not please another, and if your inner state is tied to all of this, it will constantly move. Up when you are praised, down when you are ignored, disturbed when you are misunderstood. It becomes exhausting. There is also a deeper cost. The more you seek approval, the more you move away from your own clarity. You begin to filter your thoughts through what others might think. You begin to act based on reaction, not intention. And over time, you lose a quiet connection with yourself. You stop asking, "Is this right?" and start asking, "Will this be accepted?" This weakens the mind in ways that are not immediately obvious. Decisions become slower. Confidence becomes fragile. Identity becomes unclear. Because instead of being guided from within, you are constantly adjusting from outside. The Stoics saw this as one of the most dangerous dependencies. They understood that as long as your peace depends on other people's opinions, you are not truly free. You are reacting, not choosing. You are following, not leading. And no matter how much approval you receive, it is never enough to create stability, because it can always be taken away. What they practiced instead was self-command, a steady form of inner authority. Not arrogance, not indifference to others, but a clear understanding that your actions, your values, and your judgments must come from within. They trained themselves to act according to reason, not reaction, to do what is right, not what is praised. This creates something powerful. When your actions are guided by your own principles, approval becomes less important, not irrelevant, but no longer necessary for your sense of balance. You can receive praise without becoming dependent on it. You can face criticism without being shaken by it. There is a quiet strength in this independence. It allows you to move through life with more clarity. Decisions become simpler, not because they are always easy, but because they are not influenced by every external opinion. You begin to trust your own judgment more. You begin to stand more firmly in your own direction. There is also a release that comes from letting go of constant validation. You no longer need to explain every choice. You no longer feel the pressure to be understood by everyone. You begin to accept that not everyone will agree, not everyone will approve, and that this is not a problem to be solved. It is simply part of life. The Stoics reminded themselves that other people's opinions are reflections of their own perspectives, not objective truths. What someone thinks about you is shaped by their experiences, their beliefs, their limitations. It is not a fixed measure of your worth. And once this is understood, the need to chase approval begins to fade. There is more space inside, more stability, more quiet confidence. You begin to act because it is right, not because it will be praised. You begin to speak because it is true, not because it will be accepted. You begin to live with a sense of direction that does not shift with every reaction. And in that shift, something important returns. A sense of ownership over your own life. You are no longer waiting for permission to feel okay. You are no longer depending on others to confirm your value. You are standing on something more stable, something that does not change with every opinion, your own clarity. This does not mean you stop caring about people. It means you stop needing them to define you. You still listen, you still learn, but you do not lose yourself in the process. And slowly, the mind becomes quieter, not because everyone approves of you, but because you no longer need them to. And as that need for approval begins to loosen, another layer quietly reveals itself. Even deeper than wanting people to agree with you is the need to be chosen by them. Chosen for love. Chosen for attention. Chosen for validation. Chosen as proof that you are enough. It does not always feel like dependence. It feels like longing, a quiet hope that someone will see you, accept you, and confirm your value. And for a moment, when that happens, it feels good. It feels like something has finally settled inside. But what happens when it does not? This is where the damage begins to grow. When your worth depends on being chosen, your inner state becomes fragile. Every acceptance lifts you. Every rejection lowers you. Every delay, every silence, every shift in someone's behavior starts to carry meaning. You begin to question yourself, not because something is wrong, but because someone else did not respond the way you expected. And slowly, your value begins to move outside of you. You start to measure yourself through other people's decisions. If they stay, you feel enough. If they leave, you feel lacking. If they choose someone else, you begin to compare, to doubt, to shrink. And without realizing it, your identity becomes tied to something you cannot control. This creates a quiet instability. You may still function, you may still move forward, but underneath there is a constant tension, a need to be seen in a certain way, a need to be selected, approved, kept. And this need begins to shape your actions. You become more careful, more agreeable, more willing to adjust yourself to fit what you think will make you chosen. And over time, this creates distance from who you really are. This is the hidden cost, because in trying to be chosen, you begin to abandon yourself. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that placing your worth in the hands of others creates dependence, not just emotional dependence, but a loss of inner authority. When your value comes from outside, it can be taken away at any moment. And no amount of being chosen can make that stable. What they practiced instead was self-possession, a state where your sense of worth is not given to others to decide, where your value is not based on who stays, who leaves, or who approves, but on how you live, how you act, how you carry yourself. This does not remove the desire for connection. It does not mean you stop caring about relationships. It means you stop using them as a measure of your worth. There is a quiet strength in this shift. You begin to see that being chosen is not what makes you valuable. You are already valuable, regardless of who recognizes it. And when this becomes clear, something changes in how you relate to others. You no longer approach people from a place of need. You approach from a place of presence. You can appreciate someone choosing you without depending on it. You can accept someone leaving without turning it into a statement about your worth. You can engage fully without losing yourself in the process. This creates a different kind of connection. One that is not based on fear of loss, but on clarity. One that is not driven by insecurity, but by mutual choice. And in this space, relationships become lighter, more honest, more stable. There is also a release that comes from no longer chasing validation through being selected. The constant checking, the waiting, the interpreting of small signals begins to fade. The mind becomes calmer because it is no longer trying to read meaning into every action. You begin to return to yourself. And in that return, you start to rebuild something that may have been lost for a long time. A sense of inner value that does not need to be confirmed from the outside. A sense of self that remains steady, regardless of how others respond. The Stoics reminded themselves that the only thing truly within their control is their own character, their own actions, their own way of living. Everything else, including how others feel about them, is outside that control. And once this is accepted, the need to be chosen loses its power. You still care, you still connect, but you are no longer waiting for someone else to define your worth. You are no longer handing over something that belongs to you. And slowly, something settles inside. A quiet confidence, not loud, not forced, but steady. The understanding that your value is not something to be given or taken. It is something you carry, and no matter who chooses you, or who does not, it remains. And as that sense of self begins to return, another subtle habit starts to reveal itself. Even when you no longer depend on being chosen, the mind still searches for certainty in small, ordinary moments, especially after interactions. A conversation ends, but it does not end in your mind. There is a strange tension that follows simple exchanges, a look, a tone, a pause. Something feels slightly off, and before you realize it, the mind begins to replay it. Not once, but repeatedly. What did that mean? Why did they say that? Did you say the wrong thing? Should you have responded differently? And just like that, a normal moment becomes something heavy. This is how overthinking quietly takes control. It does not come as panic. It comes as analysis. It feels like you are trying to understand, to improve, to be aware. But instead of clarity, it creates confusion. Instead of peace, it creates noise. Because the mind is not looking for truth. It is searching for certainty where none exists. Most interactions are simple, imperfect, but simple. People speak based on their own thoughts, their own moods, their own distractions. Not everything has a hidden meaning. Not every pause carries judgment. But the mind, especially when it is used to seeking approval or avoiding rejection, tries to fill in the gaps. And it fills them with doubt. You begin to assign meaning to small details. A delayed reply becomes disinterest. A short answer becomes rejection. A neutral expression becomes disapproval. And without realizing it, you are no longer remembering what happened. You are building a version of it. This is where peace begins to break, because the mind does not stop at one thought. It keeps going. It replays the moment, then adjusts it, then analyzes it again. It creates different versions, different outcomes, different possibilities, and each version carries its own emotion. This is not reflection. This is mental clutter. The Stoics understood that this kind of thinking leads nowhere. They saw that overanalyzing what has already happened does not create understanding. It creates tension. They believed that simplicity in thought is not weakness, but strength. When something happens, you see it as it is, not more, not less. If a conversation felt unclear, it remains unclear. You do not rush to fill it with assumptions. You allow it to exist without forcing meaning into it. This requires a kind of discipline, the discipline to leave things as they are, and this is where the mind begins to calm. There is also a deeper realization that changes everything. You are not responsible for how every interaction is received. You can speak clearly, act honestly, and still be misunderstood. You can do everything right and still not get the response you expected. And this is not something to fix. The Stoics focused only on what was within their control, their words, their actions, their intentions. Once those were set, they let go of the outcome. They did not carry every interaction forward into endless analysis. They allowed it to end where it ended. This creates freedom. You no longer need to revisit every moment to make sure it was perfect. You no longer feel the need to explain everything in your mind. You accept that some things are complete, even if they were not perfect. There is also a quiet trust that begins to form. Trust in your ability to act with clarity. Trust that you do not need to analyze every detail to be okay. Trust that not every unanswered question needs an answer. And with that trust, the mind becomes lighter. You start to notice when overthinking begins. The first replay, the first question, the first attempt to go back. And instead of following it, you pause. You recognize it as a pattern, not a necessity. You let it pass. At first it feels uncomfortable. The mind wants resolution. It wants certainty. But over time, it learns something new. That it can rest without having all the answers. That it can move forward without fully understanding every detail. This is where simplicity becomes powerful. Not thinking less, but thinking clearly. Not adding unnecessary layers, but staying close to what is real. The conversation happened. It is over. There is nothing more to extract from it in this moment. And in that acceptance, something shifts. The noise fades. The tension eases. The mind no longer feels crowded with unfinished thoughts. It becomes quieter, not because nothing is happening, but because you are no longer adding to it. This is the end of quiet madness, the understanding that not every moment needs to be replayed, that peace is not found in endless analysis, but in letting things be as they are, and that the mind, when freed from constant interpretation, can finally settle into stillness. And as the mind begins to quiet down from constant overthinking, something deeper starts to surface. Beneath the repeated conversations, beneath the imagined meanings, there are certain moments that carry a heavier weight. Not just memories, but judgments. Not just what happened, but what it says about you. There is a kind of feeling that does not come and go easily. It lingers. It stays. It attaches itself to your sense of identity, and over time it begins to shape how you see yourself. This is shame. It often begins with a single moment, a mistake, a failure, a decision that did not go the way you expected. At first, it is just regret. a recognition that something could have been done differently. But then the mind adds something more. It turns the action into a label. You did something wrong, becomes something is wrong with you. And once that shift happens, the weight becomes much harder to carry. Shame is not loud. It does not always appear in obvious ways. It shows up quietly, in the way you hesitate, in the way you hold back, in the way you avoid certain situations because they remind you of what you believe about yourself. It becomes a silent prison. You may continue living your life, but inside there is a part of you that feels restricted, a part that believes it has already been judged, already been defined by something that happened before. And because of that belief, you limit yourself without even noticing. You expect less, you risk less, you trust yourself less. This is how past mistakes become chains, not because they are still happening, but because the meaning attached to them is still active. The mind keeps returning to them, not to learn, but to confirm a negative identity. It keeps repeating the same message until it feels permanent. The Stoics saw this as a misunderstanding of human nature. They believed that making mistakes is part of being human, not a flaw in your character, but a natural part of learning. What matters is not the mistake itself, but how you respond to it. Whether you use it as a point of correction or a reason for self-condemnation. There is a clear difference between the two. Correction is calm. It looks at what happened, understands it, and adjusts. It does not attack. It does not exaggerate. It simply learns and moves forward. Self-condemnation is different. It is harsh. It repeats. It labels. It keeps you tied to the past instead of allowing you to grow from it. The Stoics chose correction. When they made a mistake, they did not deny it. They faced it directly, but they did not turn it into a permanent identity. They understood that a single action does not define the whole person. That growth comes from clarity, not from punishment. This creates a way out of the prison. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" you begin to ask, "What can I learn from this?" Instead of holding on to the mistake as proof of your value, you begin to see it as part of your development. This does not remove responsibility. It strengthens it. Because when you are not weighed down by shame, you are more willing to face your actions honestly. You are more open to change. You are more capable of improving because you are not trapped in self-judgment. There is also a release that comes from understanding that the past does not need to define the present. The person you were when the mistake happened is not the same person you are now. Time has passed. Awareness has grown. And with that, your capacity to act differently has changed. But if you keep holding on to shame, you do not allow that change to take place. You stay connected to an older version of yourself. The Stoics practiced letting go of this attachment, not by ignoring the past, but by placing it in its proper place, as something that happened, something that was learned from, but not something that continues to define who they are. Over time, this creates a new relationship with your own history. You can look back without feeling trapped. You can remember without being pulled into the same emotion. You can acknowledge what happened without turning it into a permanent judgment. And slowly, the chains begin to loosen. The mind becomes less restricted. The weight begins to lift. The space that was once filled with self-condemnation becomes open again, open for growth, open for new actions, open for a different way of seeing yourself. This is how the prison fades, not through denial, not through forgetting, but through understanding. The understanding that mistakes are part of the path, not the end of it. And that who you are is not defined by what you did, but by how you choose to move forward from it. And as those chains of shame begin to loosen, another pattern quietly reveals itself. Even when you understand your mistake, even when time has passed, something inside still holds on. Not to learn, not to grow, but to punish. There is a strange habit many people carry without noticing. The event has ended, the moment is gone, the consequence has already been felt, and yet the mind continues the sentence. It brings the memory back, not for clarity, but for judgment. It repeats the same thoughts, not to understand, but to remind you of what went wrong, as if suffering longer somehow balances the mistake. This is self-punishment. It often feels justified. It feels like responsibility, like you are holding yourself accountable, but in reality, it goes beyond accountability. It becomes something heavier, something unnecessary, because the event has already passed. But the punishment continues. You may notice how the mind revisits the same failure at unexpected times. A quiet moment, a small trigger, and suddenly it is there again. Not as a lesson, but as a reminder of guilt, a reminder of what you did or what you did not do. And each time, it brings the same weight. This is not growth. This is repetition of pain. There is also a deeper belief behind this habit. The idea that if you stop punishing yourself, you are letting yourself off too easily. That without this constant reminder, you might forget, you might repeat the mistake, you might lose control. So the mind keeps the pressure alive. But the Stoics saw this differently. They understood that true accountability does not come from ongoing punishment. It comes from clear understanding and corrected action. Once a mistake has been seen and learned from, continuing to suffer does not add value. It only adds weight. They practiced a form of reflection that was calm and precise. At the end of the day, they would review their actions, not to attack themselves, but to observe what went well, what did not, what could be done differently next time. And once the lesson was clear, they moved on. This is the key difference. Punishment keeps you stuck in the past. Accountability moves you forward. When you punish yourself, you stay connected to the mistake as if it is still happening. You carry it into new moments. You let it shape how you see yourself now. But when you hold yourself accountable in a Stoic way, you take what is useful and leave the rest behind. You do not carry unnecessary weight. There is also something important to understand about the nature of mistakes. They are already complete. They have already played out. The only thing that remains is how you relate to them now. And if your relationship is constant punishment, then the mistake never truly ends. The Stoics chose to end it, not by denying it, but by placing it in its proper place, as something that happened, something that was learned from, and something that no longer needs to be revisited in the same painful way. This creates a form of inner fairness. You are honest with yourself. You do not ignore your actions, but you also do not treat yourself as if you must keep paying for something that has already passed. You allow the lesson to remain, but you release the emotional sentence. This is where relief begins. At first, it may feel unfamiliar. The mind is used to returning to the mistake, used to reinforcing the guilt. Letting go of that pattern can feel like losing control, but over time, a different kind of control begins to form. A calmer one. You start to see that you can remember without punishing, that you can improve without attacking, that you can hold yourself to a high standard without turning every failure into a lasting burden. This builds trust. Trust in your ability to learn. Trust in your ability to act differently moving forward. Trust that you do not need constant pressure to stay aware. And with that trust, the need for punishment fades. You no longer feel the urge to revisit the same moment just to feel the same guilt. You no longer believe that suffering longer makes you better. You understand that growth comes from clarity, not from repeated pain. And slowly, something shifts. The mind becomes lighter. The past feels more distant. The same memory may appear, but it no longer carries the same weight. It becomes information, not a sentence. This is the wiser form of accountability, not harsh, not endless, but steady. The ability to face what happened, learn from it, and then release it fully. The ability to move forward without dragging the same burden into every new step. And in that release, you begin to experience something that may have been missing for a long time. Relief, not because nothing went wrong, but because you are no longer holding yourself captive for it. And as that habit of self-punishment begins to fade, something deeper quietly comes into view. Beneath the guilt, beneath the repeated memories, there are older wounds, ones that did not begin with you holding yourself accountable, but with moments where you were not chosen, not accepted, not understood, and somehow they still hurt. There is a kind of pain that does not leave easily, not because it is constantly remembered, but because it shaped something inside you early on. A rejection that felt personal, a moment where you reached out and were met with distance, a time when you needed connection, and it was not there. These moments do not always stay as clear memories, but they leave something behind, a sensitivity, a quiet expectation, a subtle fear that it could happen again. And so, even years later, a small sign of rejection can reopen something deeper. A delayed reply, a shift in tone, a lack of attention. It may seem small on the surface, but the feeling it triggers is much larger. This is not just about the present moment. It is the echo of something older. The mind remembers what hurt before, and it tries to protect you. But instead of creating calm, it creates tension. It watches closely, it reacts quickly, it assumes the worst. Not because it is accurate, but because it is trying to avoid being hurt in the same way again. And without realizing it, you begin to carry that old wound into new situations. You may become more cautious, more aware of how others respond, more affected by how you are treated. And slowly, your emotional state begins to depend on how others behave. This is where the bleeding continues, not because rejection is happening constantly, but because the old wound has not fully healed. It is still sensitive, still active, still influencing how you experience the present. There is also a deeper layer to this. When rejection is felt strongly enough, it can create a belief. A quiet conclusion about yourself, that you are not enough, that you are not valued, that you must do more, be more, change something to be accepted. And once that belief is formed, it begins to guide your actions. You may try harder to be liked, you may adjust yourself to avoid disapproval, you may seek reassurance, attention, confirmation, not in an obvious way, but in small, subtle ways that shape your behavior. This creates a hidden dependence. Because now, part of your emotional stability depends on being received well by others, on not being rejected again, on being seen in a certain way. The Stoics understood this pattern deeply. They saw that when your sense of worth depends on external acceptance, you are placing your peace in something uncertain, something that can change at any moment. And no matter how careful you are, you cannot control how others respond. What they practiced instead was inner strength. Not the kind that blocks emotion, but the kind that stands steady regardless of external reaction. They trained themselves to find their value in their own actions, their own character, their own clarity, not in whether they were accepted or rejected. This changes everything. When you no longer rely on others to confirm your worth, rejection loses its power. It may still be felt, but it does not reach as deeply. It does not define you. It does not reopen old wounds in the same way. There is also a shift in how you see rejection itself. Instead of viewing it as a reflection of your value, you begin to see it as a reflection of fit, of circumstance, of timing, of the other person's perspective. Not everything that does not work out is a statement about you. And once this becomes clear, the emotional charge begins to soften. You no longer feel the need to be rescued from rejection. You no longer look for someone to repair what was hurt. You begin to stand on your own sense of self, steady and grounded. This does not remove the desire for connection. It removes the dependence on it for your sense of worth. And in that independence, something begins to heal. The old wound is no longer constantly touched. It is no longer being reopened by every small moment. It begins to settle, to close, to fade, not because it never mattered, but because it no longer controls your present. You start to move differently, with less fear, with less need for constant reassurance, with a quiet confidence that does not depend on being accepted by everyone. And slowly, the bleeding stops, not because rejection disappears, but because it no longer reaches the same place inside you. You are no longer carrying the same sensitivity, the same expectation, the same need to be protected from it. You are standing stronger, not hardened, not closed off, but clear. The understanding that your value was never meant to be decided by others, and that what once hurt you deeply does not have to continue shaping how you live now. And as that old sensitivity begins to settle, another pattern quietly rises from beneath it. Not just the pain of what happened, but the tension around what should have happened, a different outcome, a better response, a moment handled another way. There is a quiet habit the mind falls into when something does not go as expected. It begins to rewrite reality, not in the world, but inside. It builds a version of events where things turned out better, where you said the right thing, where they acted differently, where the result was not painful. And then it compares that version to what actually happened. This is where the wound deepens, because reality cannot compete with imagination. The version in your mind is cleaner, smoother, more controlled, and the more you return to it, the more the real moment begins to feel wrong, incomplete, unfair. This is the beginning of what if. What if you had done this instead? What if you had seen it earlier? What if things had gone differently? These thoughts seem harmless at first, even useful. They feel like reflection, like learning. But without awareness, they become something else. They become resistance, a quiet refusal to accept that what happened has already happened. The mind keeps going back, not to understand, but to change something that cannot be changed. It keeps adjusting the details, replaying the scene, trying to find a version that feels better. And each time it does this, it moves further away from reality. This is how suffering extends beyond the moment. The event itself may have lasted minutes, but the resistance to it can last years. Not because the pain is still happening, but because the mind has not allowed it to be complete. It keeps the moment open. The Stoics saw this as one of the main sources of unnecessary suffering, not the event itself, but the refusal to accept it fully. They understood that reality does not need your agreement to exist. It simply is. And the more you argue with it, the more tension you create. They practice something that feels simple but requires deep discipline. Acceptance. Not passive acceptance, not giving up, but a clear acknowledgement of what is. A recognition that the past is fixed, and that no amount of thinking can reshape it. This is where healing begins, when you stop asking, why did this happen this way, and start seeing that it has already happened. When you stop comparing reality to imagined alternatives and begin to face it as it is. This does not remove the feeling immediately. The disappointment, the regret, the discomfort may still be there. But without resistance, those feelings begin to move. They are no longer held in place by the constant replay of what if. They begin to pass. There is also a deeper shift that comes with this acceptance. You begin to understand that the mind's need for a perfect outcome is what creates much of the suffering. The expectation that things should have gone differently is what makes the actual result feel heavier. But life does not follow imagined scripts. The Stoics trained themselves to expect imperfection, not in a negative way, but in a realistic one. They knew that people make mistakes, that situations unfold unpredictably, that outcomes are not always within control. And because of this, they were less disturbed when things did not go as planned. They did not build ideal versions of the past. They worked with what was real. This creates a kind of peace that is not dependent on perfect outcomes, a steadiness that does not break when things go differently than expected. You begin to see that the moment, as it happened, was part of a larger process. That even mistakes, even uncomfortable outcomes carry something useful if they are not resisted. But that usefulness is only available when the mind stops trying to rewrite the event. There is also a release that comes from letting go of the need to get it right every time. The mind often replays situations because it wants to find the perfect response, the perfect action, the perfect outcome. But perfection is not the goal. Clarity is. And clarity comes from seeing what happened without distortion, without adding layers of imagined alternatives, without holding on to a version that never existed. Over time, this changes how you relate to your past. You no longer see it as something to fix. You see it as something to understand and leave behind. The what-if begins to lose its pull, not because you force it away, but because you no longer feed it. You return to what is, and in that return, something settles. The tension eases. The constant comparison fades. The mind becomes quieter, not because everything went perfectly, but because you are no longer arguing with what has already happened. This is the end of the inner struggle. The understanding that reality, once accepted, no longer needs to be fought, and that peace is not found in changing the past, but in releasing the need to. And as that resistance begins to fade, something even more subtle continues to operate beneath it. Not the what-if this time, but the quiet replay of what was done to you. Not to fix it, not to understand it, but to feel it again, with anger. There is a kind of memory that does not just return. It rebuilds itself. A moment from the past appears, and with it comes a familiar feeling. Tightness, frustration, a sense that something was unfair, and before you notice, the mind begins to add to it. It sharpens the details, it strengthens the emotion, it fills the moment with everything that should have been different. This is resentment. It does not always feel loud. Sometimes it is calm on the surface, but active underneath. A quiet holding on, a refusal to let the moment rest. A steady replay of the same event, not for clarity, but for emotional reinforcement. And each time it is replayed, the past becomes present again. This is how pain stays alive, because resentment does not just remember what happened. It relives it with added intensity. It keeps the wound open, not by accident, but by repeated attention. The mind returns to the same story, the same injustice, the same feeling, and feeds it, like adding fuel to a fire that would have faded on its own. There is also something deeper happening here. Resentment often feels justified. It feels like holding on to it is a form of strength. Like letting it go would mean accepting what happened or allowing it to be okay. But the Stoics saw this clearly. Holding on to anger does not protect you. It binds you. Because while the event itself is over, resentment keeps you connected to it. It ties your present state to something that cannot be changed. It allows a past moment to continue shaping how you feel now. And in doing so, it quietly takes your energy. Every time the mind returns to that memory with anger, it drains something. It takes focus away from the present. It takes calm away from your inner state. It keeps your attention locked in something that offers no movement, no resolution. This is the cost, not just emotional, but mental. A constant tension that builds over time, a background noise that never fully settles, and often it spreads. One resentment leads to another. One unresolved moment connects to others, until the mind becomes filled with layers of past frustration. The Stoics practiced something very different. They understood that while you cannot control what others do, you can control how long you carry it. They chose not to feed the fire, not by pretending nothing happened, but by refusing to keep reliving it with the same intensity. This is where the shift begins. When the memory appears, instead of adding anger, you pause. You see it clearly, but you do not build on it. You do not replay the same story with the same emotion. You allow the moment to exist without strengthening it. This weakens the pattern. There is also a deeper understanding that changes how you see the situation. People act based on their own limitations, their own understanding, their own state of mind. What hurt you may have come from ignorance, from confusion, from their own struggles. This does not excuse the action, but it removes the need to carry it indefinitely. The Stoics believed that holding on to anger harms the one who holds it more than the one it is directed at, because the other person is no longer present, but the emotion is, and it continues to affect your state, your clarity, your peace. Letting go is not about them. It is about you. It is about freeing your mind from constant return, from repeated emotional spikes, from being tied to something that no longer exists outside your memory. This does not happen all at once. Resentment has momentum. It has been practiced, repeated, reinforced, but with awareness, the pattern can be interrupted. Each time you choose not to feed it, it loses a little strength. Each time you allow the memory to pass without adding anger, the fire cools. Over time, the intensity fades. The same event may still be remembered, but it no longer carries the same emotional weight. It becomes something that happened, not something that continues to happen inside you. This creates space. Space for calm, space for clarity, space to move forward without carrying layers of past tension, space to respond to the present without being influenced by old anger. And slowly, something shifts. The mind becomes lighter. The constant background frustration begins to disappear. The need to revisit the same moment fades, not because it never mattered, but because it no longer controls your inner state. This is the quiet end of resentment, not forced, not denied, but released. The understanding that holding on to anger does not change the past, it only extends it. And that true strength is not in keeping the fire alive, but in choosing to let it go. And as that fire of resentment begins to cool, something else quietly comes into view. Not the anger that stays alive, but the tension that never fully ends. The feeling that something inside is still unsettled, still open, still unfinished. There are moments in life that do not close cleanly. A conversation that never reached resolution, a conflict that ended without clarity, a truth that was never spoken, a boundary that was never set. These moments do not always leave loudly. They linger quietly, like unfinished thoughts that the mind keeps returning to. This is the weight of unfinished emotional battles. It does not always feel intense, but it is constant. A low-level pressure in the background, a subtle pull on your attention. You may be doing something else, focused on the present, and suddenly the mind drifts back. Not to feel the same anger, not to relive the same pain, but to revisit something that feels incomplete, something that never settled. And each time it returns, it takes a little energy with it. This is how the drain begins. Not through one big moment, but through many small returns. The mind keeps checking the same situation, as if looking for a conclusion that was never reached. It replays the details, not with intensity, but with persistence, a quiet search for closure. But closure does not come this way, because the mind is trying to finish something that no longer exists in the present. The situation has ended, the people have moved on, the moment has passed, but internally it is still open. And this is where the exhaustion builds. Unfinished emotional loops require attention to stay active. They pull you back again and again, asking for resolution, and if they are not addressed clearly, they continue. Not loudly, but steadily. The Stoics understood this pattern deeply. They knew that the mind seeks completion. It wants things to make sense. It wants situations to be resolved. But they also knew that not every situation in life ends with perfect clarity. Not every conflict is settled. Not every question is answered. So they practiced something different. They created their own closure. Instead of waiting for the external situation to resolve, they brought clarity within themselves. They asked, "What is within my control here? What part of this belongs to me? What can I understand, accept, and release on my own?" This is where the loop begins to close. You may not get the apology. You may not have the final conversation. You may not be able to explain your side fully. But you can still reach a point of internal clarity. You can understand what happened from your perspective. You can recognize what you would do differently now. You can accept that the situation is over, even if it did not end the way you wanted. And once that clarity is reached, something shifts. The mind no longer needs to return. There is also a quiet dignity in this process. Instead of chasing resolution from others, you stand in your own understanding. You do not need every loose end tied perfectly. You do not need every situation to be complete externally. You become complete within yourself. This does not mean ignoring what mattered. It means honoring it without staying stuck in it. It means allowing the experience to exist, while also allowing yourself to move forward. The Stoics practiced this kind of inner resolution daily. They reflected on their actions, their thoughts, their responses. They corrected what needed to be corrected, accepted what could not be changed, and then they let it rest. They did not carry every unfinished moment into the next day. This preserved their energy, because when the mind is not occupied with unresolved loops, it becomes lighter, more focused, more present. The constant background pull disappears. The attention that was being drained returns to you, and with that, your inner state becomes more stable. You are no longer being pulled back into past situations that have already ended. You are no longer spending energy on things that cannot be completed externally. You are grounded in what is here, what is real, what can actually be acted upon. This is where peace begins to deepen. Not because everything in your life has been resolved, but because you have stopped waiting for perfect endings. You have created your own sense of completion, and slowly the weight lifts. The mind becomes quieter. The loops stop repeating. The unfinished battles no longer demand your attention, not because they were solved externally, but because they were closed internally. This is the quiet strength of Stoic clarity. The ability to finish what life leaves unfinished within yourself. And as those inner loops begin to close, another force quietly reveals itself. Not the need for clarity this time, but the desire for balance, a feeling that something must be made even, that what was done to you must be returned in some way. There is a pull that can feel powerful, the urge to correct a wrong by creating another, to make someone feel what you felt, to restore a sense of fairness by shifting the pain back to where it came from. This is the desire for revenge. It does not always appear as action. Sometimes it stays in the mind, a quiet imagining of outcomes, a picture of them realizing what they did, a scenario where they face consequences that match your experience. And for a moment, it feels satisfying, but that feeling does not last. Because revenge does not release you, it connects you. Every time the mind returns to that person, to that situation, to that imagined outcome, it strengthens the link. You are no longer just remembering what happened. You are staying tied to it. Your attention, your energy, your inner state, all remain connected to something that has already passed. This is how the trap forms. It feels like movement, like you are doing something about what happened, but in reality, you are staying in the same place. The mind circles the same event, the same person, the same desire for something to be corrected. And in doing so, it keeps you bound. There is also something deeper happening beneath this desire, a sense that peace cannot return until the other person feels the same pain. That closure depends on them suffering, understanding, or acknowledging what they did. But the Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that tying your peace to someone else's outcome is another form of dependence. It places your inner state in something you cannot control. Whether they change, whether they suffer, whether they understand, none of it is guaranteed. And while you wait, you remain connected. This is the cost. Not just emotional, but spiritual, because your focus is no longer on your own growth, your own clarity, your own direction. It is on them, on what they did, on what they should feel, on what should happen to them. And slowly, your life begins to revolve around a past moment. The Stoics chose a different path. They practiced self-mastery, not mastery over others, not control over outcomes, but control over their own responses. They understood that true strength is not in making others suffer, but in not needing them to suffer for you to be at peace. This is where freedom begins. When you no longer require an external outcome to feel resolved, when you no longer depend on someone else's realization to move forward, when you release the idea that balance must come through revenge. There is also a shift in how you see the situation. Instead of focusing on what was taken from you, you begin to focus on what remains within your control. Your actions, your mindset, your direction moving forward. You take back ownership of your inner world. And in doing so, the connection weakens. You are no longer pulled back into the same emotional state. You are no longer feeding the same thoughts. The person, the event, the memory, they begin to lose their hold. Not because they never mattered, but because you are no longer giving them the same energy. There is also a quiet strength in choosing not to act on revenge. It is not weakness. It is discipline. The ability to feel the urge, to recognize it, and to not follow it. To understand that acting on it would only extend the connection, not end it. This creates distance. Distance from the event, distance from the person, distance from the emotional weight that was once attached. And in that distance, clarity begins to grow. You start to see that holding on to revenge was not protecting you. It was keeping you tied to something that needed to end. And once you release it, something shifts inside. There is more space. Space for new thoughts, new experiences, new direction. The past no longer occupies the same place in your mind. It becomes something behind you, not something you are still standing inside. And slowly, the sense of being bound fades. You are no longer waiting for anything from them, no longer expecting a moment that will make everything feel right. You have stepped out of that cycle completely. This is the freedom Stoicism points to. Not the control of others, but the control of self. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the peace of release. The understanding that your life moves forward, not when others change, but when you stop needing them to. And in that moment, something becomes clear. You are no longer in their shadow. You have stepped into your own. And as that attachment to revenge begins to fall away, another quieter dependency comes into view. Not the need to get even, but the need to be seen, to be understood, to be acknowledged in a way that finally settles something inside. There is a subtle hunger that many people carry without realizing it. The desire for someone to notice your effort, to recognize your worth, to understand your intentions without you having to explain them. And when that happens, even briefly, it feels like relief, like something inside has been confirmed. But when it does not happen, the opposite follows. There is a quiet instability that begins to grow, a sense that something is missing, that something needs to be said, shown, or proven in order to feel okay. And without noticing, your emotional state begins to depend on how others respond to you. This is the trap of emotional validation. It does not look dramatic. It appears in small ways, checking for reactions, waiting for replies, thinking about how something was received, hoping to be understood in a certain way. And when that understanding does not come, the mind begins to react. It questions, it explains, it replays, and slowly, peace becomes conditional. You feel steady when you are noticed. You feel unsettled when you are not. You feel clear when you are understood. You feel frustrated when you are misread. And because these things are outside your control, your inner state keeps shifting. This creates constant movement. Not because life is unstable, but because your sense of balance is tied to something that changes moment to moment. Other people's attention, other people's interpretation, other people's awareness of you. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the more your peace depends on being seen a certain way, the less stable it becomes. Because you cannot control how deeply others understand you. You cannot control how much they notice. You cannot control how they interpret your actions. And if your calm depends on these things, it will never fully settle. What they practiced instead was inner sufficiency, a quiet form of completeness that does not rely on constant external confirmation. They trained themselves to act with clarity, to speak with honesty, and then to let go of how it was received. This does not mean they did not care about others. It means they did not depend on others to feel grounded. There is a difference. You can value connection without needing it to confirm your worth. You can communicate without needing to be perfectly understood. You can express yourself without needing a specific response in return. And when this shift happens, something important changes. The mind becomes quieter. You are no longer constantly checking how you are being perceived. You are no longer adjusting your internal state based on external reactions. You begin to trust your own clarity more than the feedback you receive. This builds stability. You act because it is right, not because it will be noticed. You speak because it is true, not because it will be praised. You move through life with a sense of direction that is not dependent on constant recognition. And in that independence there is relief. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone will see your intentions clearly. Not everyone will notice what you do. And this is not a problem to solve. It is simply reality. The Stoics accepted this fully. They did not expect perfect understanding from others. They focused on being clear within themselves, and once that clarity was established, they allowed everything else to be as it was. This removes a great deal of pressure. You no longer feel the need to explain everything. You no longer carry the weight of being misunderstood. You no longer spend energy trying to control how others see you. You become more at ease. Over time, this creates a kind of inner steadiness that does not shift easily. Your emotional state is no longer tied to every reaction. It is grounded in something deeper, your own understanding of yourself. And with that understanding, something settles. The hunger for validation fades, not because you no longer care, but but because you no longer need it in the same way. You are not waiting to be confirmed. You are not searching for constant acknowledgement. You are already standing on something stable. This is the quiet strength of inner sufficiency. Not isolation, not indifference, but independence. The ability to exist without needing every part of you to be seen, understood, or praised in order to feel at peace. And in that state, something becomes clear. Your worth was never meant to be measured by how well others recognize it. It was always something you carry, whether it is noticed or not. And as that need for validation begins to fade, something deeper becomes visible. Not just the desire to be seen, but the fear of being seen in the wrong way, the fear of judgment. It does not always feel intense. Sometimes it is quiet, almost hidden. It shows up in hesitation, in the pause before speaking, in the decision to stay silent instead of expressing what you really think. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you are thinking about how it will be received. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to adjust yourself. You soften your opinions. You hide certain parts of your personality. You present a version of yourself that feels safer, more acceptable, less likely to be criticized, and over time, this version becomes familiar. But it is not fully you. This is how personality begins to deform, not through force, but through avoidance. The mind learns that being fully expressed may lead to discomfort, rejection, or criticism. So it creates a safer version, a version that fits better, a version that avoids friction. And while this may protect you in the moment, it creates a deeper cost. You begin to feel disconnected from yourself. There is a quiet tension that comes from not fully expressing who you are, a sense that something is being held back, a feeling that your actions are not completely aligned with your thoughts. And over time, this misalignment creates inner discomfort, because you are no longer acting from clarity. You are acting from fear. The fear of being judged keeps you constantly adjusting, watching how you speak, how you act, how you are perceived. And because you cannot control how others judge you, the fear never fully settles. It becomes a constant background pressure. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that as long as your actions are guided by the opinions of others, you are not truly free. Because those opinions are unstable, they change, they differ from person to person, and trying to satisfy them all is impossible. So they chose a different foundation. They acted based on reason, based on their own understanding of what is right. They focused on living in alignment with their principles, not in alignment with public approval. This is where authenticity begins, not as an act of rebellion, but as clarity. The willingness to express what you genuinely think and feel without shaping it to avoid every possible reaction. The ability to stand in your own perspective, even when it is not agreed with. This does not mean being careless. It means being honest without being controlled by fear. There is also a deeper shift that happens when you stop trying to avoid judgment. You begin to see that judgment is not something you can eliminate. It will happen regardless. People will interpret you based on their own views, their own experiences, their own biases. And once you accept this, something changes. The pressure to control how you are seen begins to fade. You no longer need to adjust every part of yourself to fit every expectation. You begin to act more naturally, more directly, more in line with what you actually believe. This creates a sense of alignment. Your actions match your thoughts. Your words reflect your understanding. There is less internal conflict, less second-guessing, less need to constantly monitor yourself. And with that, the mind becomes calmer. There is also a quiet confidence that grows from this way of living. Not loud, not forced, but steady. The confidence that comes from knowing you, are acting from your own clarity, not from fear of reaction. And even when judgment comes, it does not affect you in the same way, because you are no longer measuring yourself through it. The Stoics practice this by reminding themselves that their value is not determined by external opinion. It is determined by their own actions, their own character, their own adherence to reason. This creates independence. You can listen to feedback without being controlled by it. You can consider other perspectives without abandoning your own. You can engage with others without losing your sense of self. And slowly, the deformation begins to reverse. The parts of you that were hidden begin to return. The tension that came from constant adjustment begins to ease. You start to feel more like yourself again, not a version shaped by fear, but a version grounded in clarity. This is what fearless authenticity looks like, not the absence of judgment, but the absence of dependence on it, the ability to be fully present as yourself, without needing to filter every part of you through the reactions of others. And in that state, something settles. You are no longer performing, you are no longer hiding, you are simply being. And that is where real peace begins. And as that fear of judgment begins to loosen its grip, another habit quietly reveals itself. Not just the need to be accepted, but the need to be fully understood. The urge to make sure nothing about you is misread, misinterpreted, or left unclear. So you explain. You explain your decisions. You explain your intentions. You explain your tone, your actions, your silence. You go over details again, adding more words, more context, more reasons, hoping that this time it will land the way you want it to. And for a moment it feels like control, but over time it becomes exhausting. There is a quiet drain that comes from constantly explaining yourself. Not just the effort of speaking, but the mental weight behind it. The need to get it right. The pressure to be understood exactly as you intended. The fear that if you do not explain enough, something about you will be seen incorrectly. And so the cycle continues. A simple interaction becomes long. A clear decision becomes complicated. A moment that could have passed quietly becomes something that needs to be justified. And without realizing it, you begin to lose something important, your sense of dignity. Because over-explaining often comes from a place of doubt, a subtle feeling that your actions are not enough on their own, that they need to be supported, defended, expanded, in order to be accepted. And when that becomes a habit, it weakens your presence. Not because you are wrong, but because you are constantly placing your clarity beneath someone else's understanding. You are trying to shape your truth in a way that will be received perfectly. But that is not always possible. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that you can speak with honesty, act with intention, and still be misunderstood. Not because you failed to explain, but because others interpret things through their own perspective. And no amount of words can fully control that. So they practiced something different. They spoke when needed, and then they stopped. They trusted that their actions, their tone, their consistency would carry more weight than endless explanation. They did not feel the need to justify every decision or correct every misunderstanding. This is the power of quiet certainty, a calm confidence in your own clarity. The understanding that once you have expressed yourself honestly, the outcome is no longer yours to manage. You do not need to chase understanding. You do not need to force agreement. You allow space. At first, this feels uncomfortable. The mind is used to filling the silence, to adding more, to making sure everything is clear. But when you begin to step back, you notice something important. Not everything needs to be explained. Some things can simply be. There is also a shift in how you see misunderstanding. Instead of viewing it as something to fix immediately, You begin to accept that it is part of communication. Not everyone will see things the same way. Not everyone will grasp your intention fully. And this is not always your responsibility. The Stoics focused on what was within their control, their words, their actions, their clarity of thought. Once those were aligned, they did not spend energy trying to control how others received it. This preserves energy, because when you stop over-explaining, you free your mind from constant justification. You are no longer replaying conversations, adding more details, wondering if you should have said more. You become more direct, more grounded, more at ease. And with that, something shifts. Your presence becomes stronger. Not louder, not more forceful, but steadier. There is less need to convince, less need to prove, less need to manage perception. You stand in what you know without needing to expand it endlessly. There is also a quiet respect that comes from this. When you speak with clarity and then allow space, your words carry more weight. They are not diluted by over-explanation. They are not lost in unnecessary detail. They are simple, direct, and complete. This builds trust, not just from others, but within yourself. You begin to trust that you do not need to overcompensate, that your understanding is enough, that your expression, when honest, does not need to be constantly adjusted. And slowly, the exhaustion fades. The mind becomes lighter. Conversations become simpler. You are no longer carrying the pressure to be perfectly understood at all times. You allow things to unfold without needing to control every detail. This is the quiet strength of restraint, knowing when to speak and knowing when to stop. And in that balance, something settles. You are no longer chasing clarity from others. You are resting in your own. And as that need to explain begins to settle, something even deeper comes into focus. Not just how you are seen, but how you connect. The way you feel about others, the way you hold on, the way you need. There is a kind of feeling that is often mistaken for love. It feels intense. It feels important. It feels like you cannot be without the other person. Their presence brings relief. Their absence brings discomfort. Their attention lifts you. Their distance unsettles you. And because it feels so strong, it is often called love. But something about it is unstable. There is a constant need beneath it, a quiet dependency, a sense that your emotional state is tied to their actions, how they respond, how they speak, how they show up. And when they shift even slightly, your inner world shifts with them. This is not connection. This is dependence. It often begins from a deeper place, from wounds that were never fully healed, moments where connection was uncertain, where attention was inconsistent, where love felt like something you had to earn or hold on to carefully. And over time, the mind learns something. It learns that closeness must be secured, that attention must be maintained, that love can be lost. So when it finds someone who brings comfort, it holds tightly. This creates a powerful attachment, not because the connection is pure, but because it feels like something that must not be lost. The other person becomes more than a companion. They become a source of emotional stability, a way to feel okay, a way to feel complete. And this is where confusion begins, because the intensity feels like love. The constant thinking, the emotional highs and lows, the need to be close, the fear of distance, it all feels meaningful. But beneath it, there is imbalance, there is dependence, there is a quiet fear driving the connection. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that true love does not come from need, it comes from stability, from being whole within yourself and then choosing to share that with someone else, not to fill a gap, but to express something already grounded. This changes everything. When you are emotionally dependent, the connection is heavy. It carries pressure, it carries expectation, it carries fear of loss. But when you are emotionally balanced, the connection becomes lighter, freer, more stable. You are not holding on, you are relating. There is also a shift in how you experience closeness. You no longer feel the need to be constantly reassured. You no longer look for signs to confirm that everything is okay. You are present with the person, not attached to their every movement. This creates peace, not because the relationship is perfect, but because your inner state is not controlled by it. You can care deeply without losing yourself. You can connect without depending. You can love without needing to be rescued. This is the balance Stoicism points to. The understanding that your emotional foundation must come from within, that no one else can carry that responsibility for you, and that when you try to place it on someone else, the connection becomes strained, because it is carrying more than it should. There is also a quiet strength in letting go of the need to be completed by another person, not in a distant or cold way, but in a grounded way, knowing that you are already enough, and that connection is something you share, not something you rely on to feel whole. This removes pressure from the relationship. It allows both people to exist freely, without constant expectation, without the need to fix, to rescue, to prove. The connection becomes something natural, not something that needs to be constantly maintained through emotional effort. And slowly, something shifts. The intensity settles. The highs and lows become less extreme. The mind becomes calmer. The connection feels more real, more stable, more aligned. Not driven by fear, but supported by clarity. This is what real love begins to look like. Not loud, not consuming, but steady. A connection that adds to your life, not one that controls it. A presence that brings warmth, not one that holds your peace hostage. And in that state, something becomes clear. You are no longer searching to be rescued. You are standing fully on your own and choosing to connect from that place. And as that emotional balance begins to take shape, something quieter comes into view. Not the need for others this time, but the way you relate to yourself when something feels off, when something inside you is unsettled, uncomfortable, or quietly asking for attention. There is a habit many people develop without realizing it. When something disturbs them, they look away. They stay busy. They distract themselves. They tell themselves it is nothing. They push the feeling aside and move on, hoping it will fade on its own. And for a while, it works. The discomfort softens, the mind shifts, the day continues, but something remains. Because what is ignored does not disappear. It stays beneath the surface, not loud, not obvious, but present. A quiet tension that builds slowly, a feeling that something inside has not been addressed, and over time this becomes a deeper kind of damage. Not from the original disturbance, but from the neglect of it. This is self-betrayal, not in a dramatic way, but in small, repeated moments. Each time you dismiss what you feel, each time you avoid looking at something that matters, each time you choose comfort over clarity, you move further away from yourself. There is also a reason this happens. Facing what disturbs you is not easy. It requires honesty. It requires stillness. It requires you to sit with something that may not feel good. And the mind naturally wants to avoid discomfort, so it chooses distraction. But distraction only delays what needs to be seen. The Stoics practiced something different. They turned toward what disturbed them, not with fear, not with judgment, but with clarity. When something felt off, they did not push it away. They examined it. They asked, "What is this feeling? Where is it coming from? What does it show me about my thoughts, my actions, my expectations?" This is where healing begins. Not in avoidance, but in understanding. When you allow yourself to see what is happening inside without immediately trying to escape it, something changes. The feeling becomes clearer. It loses some of its confusion. It becomes something you can work with rather than something you need to hide from. There is also a quiet respect in this process. You are no longer dismissing your own experience. You are no longer pretending everything is fine when it is not. You are giving yourself the attention that you may have been seeking elsewhere. And that builds trust. Trust in your ability to face what is real. Trust that you do not need to run from discomfort. Trust that clarity is more valuable than temporary relief. This does not mean you become overwhelmed by every feeling. It means you stop ignoring them. You allow them to be seen, to be understood, and then to be released properly. Not pushed down, not covered up, but processed with awareness. The Stoics understood that unexamined emotions tend to grow. When something is ignored, it does not stay the same. It often becomes stronger, more complex, more difficult to address later. But when it is faced early with calm attention, it remains manageable. It can be understood and let go. There is also a deeper shift that comes from this honesty. You begin to live more aligned with yourself. Your actions match your awareness. Your decisions come from clarity, not avoidance. You are no longer moving through life with hidden tension beneath the surface. You are present. And with that presence, the inner damage begins to heal. Not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily. Each time you choose to face what disturbs you instead of ignoring it, you repair something. You close a gap that was created by avoidance. You return to yourself. And over time, that return becomes natural. You no longer need to pretend everything is fine. You no longer fear your own inner world. You know that whatever arises can be seen, understood, and handled. This is the beginning of real healing. Not the absence of discomfort, but the presence of honesty. The willingness to look inward without turning away. The strength to face what is there without needing to escape it. And in that honesty, something settles. You are no longer betraying yourself. You are finally listening. And as that honesty with yourself begins to deepen, another quiet pattern starts to reveal itself. Not something you speak about, but something that happens in private, in the silent moments, when you look at your life and then look at someone else's. There is a subtle habit the mind slips into. It begins to measure, not in a loud way, not openly, but quietly, their progress against yours, their success against yours, their life against yours. And without realizing it, the mind begins to draw conclusions. Where you stand, what you lack, what you should have done by now. And slowly, something begins to shift inside. There is a kind of discomfort that comes from this. Not sharp, not immediate, but steady. A quiet dissatisfaction, a sense that what you have is not enough, not because it truly is not, but because it does not match what you see elsewhere. This is how comparison begins to corrupt the inner world. It takes something neutral and turns it into something lacking. It takes your own path and makes it feel incomplete. And the more you engage with it, the more it grows. Because the mind does not compare fairly, it selects what stands out. The visible success, the highlights, the results. It does not see the full picture. It does not see the effort, the struggle, the uncertainty behind what it is comparing to. It builds a one-sided view and then measures your entire life against it. And this creates silent despair. Not because your life is lacking, but because the standard you are using is distorted. The Stoics understood this clearly. They knew that when your attention is directed outward constantly, your sense of value becomes unstable, because you are no longer living your life, you are measuring it, and measurement without context leads to dissatisfaction. so they turned their focus inward. Not in isolation, but in direction. They asked a different question. Not, how do I compare, but am I living according to my own principles? Not, do I have more or less, but am I using what I have well? This shifts everything. Your attention returns to what is within your control, your actions, your effort, your choices, your growth. You are no longer tracking someone else's path. You are walking your own with clarity. There is also a deeper peace that comes from this. When you stop comparing, you stop creating unnecessary pressure. You are no longer trying to match someone else's timeline. You are no longer feeling behind or ahead. You are simply where you are, moving at your own pace, and that removes a great deal of tension. The mind becomes quieter. You are not constantly evaluating yourself against others. You are not turning every achievement into something small because someone else has more. You begin to see your life as its own path, not as a reflection of someone else's. This builds a different kind of confidence, not one based on being better or worse, but one based on alignment. The sense that you are moving in a direction that makes sense for you, that your actions are consistent with your understanding, that your life is not something to compare, but something to live. There is also a release that comes from letting go of the need to measure everything. Not every moment needs to be evaluated. Not every outcome needs to be ranked. Some things can simply be experienced without turning them into a comparison. This brings a sense of presence. You begin to appreciate what is in front of you without immediately relating it to something else. You begin to value your own progress without needing it to look a certain way. You begin to feel more grounded in your own experience. And slowly, the quiet despair fades. Not because life becomes perfect, but because you are no longer distorting it through comparison. You are seeing it more clearly, more directly, more honestly. The Stoics practiced gratitude for what they had, not as a way to ignore what they lacked, but as a way to remain grounded. They focused on using what was available to them rather than constantly looking at what others possessed. This creates stability. Your sense of value is no longer pulled in different directions. It is centered. It is based on something that does not change with every new comparison. And in that center, something settles. You are no longer watching your life from the outside. You are living it from within. And that is where real peace begins. And as that habit of comparison begins to fade, another quiet waiting pattern comes into view. Not comparing yourself to others this time, but waiting on them. Waiting for something that feels like it will finally settle what is still unsettled inside you. A conversation that never happened. An apology that never came. An explanation that would make everything make sense. A return that would somehow restore what was lost. There is a part of the mind that believes peace is on the other side of that moment, so it waits. Not always consciously, not always in obvious ways, but quietly. It holds a space open. It keeps the situation alive. It leaves the door slightly open, just in case something arrives that will complete the story. This is the trap of waiting for closure. It feels reasonable. It feels like something is missing, and that missing piece belongs to someone else. If they would just say the right words, if they would just understand, if they would just come back, then everything would feel resolved. But what often happens is different. Nothing comes. Or what comes is not enough, not clear enough, not sincere enough, not aligned with what you hoped for. And so the waiting continues. The mind remains in that unfinished space, expecting something that may never arrive. This is how healing gets delayed. Not because time has not passed, but because the mind has not allowed the situation to close. It has handed the final step to someone else. It has made peace dependent on an external action. And because that action is outside your control, the waiting becomes indefinite. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that placing your sense of resolution in someone else's hands creates dependence. Not just emotional dependence, but a kind of inner suspension. You are not fully in the present because part of you is still tied to something unresolved. So they practiced something different. They created their own closure, not by ignoring what happened, not by pretending it did not matter, but by accepting that they may never receive the explanation they wanted, that the apology may never come, that the situation may remain incomplete from the outside. And instead of waiting, they turned inward. They asked, "What do I know about this situation? What have I learned from it? What part of this can I understand and accept on my own?" This is where closure begins to form. Not as a perfect ending, but as a clear understanding. You see what happened as it was. You recognize what was within your control and what was not. You allow yourself to feel what needs to be felt, and then you release the need for anything more. This does not erase the past, but it stops it from remaining open. There is also a quiet strength in no longer waiting, in no longer holding space for something that may never come. You are not closing the door out of bitterness. You are closing it out of clarity. You are choosing to move forward. The Stoics believed that your peace must not depend on things you cannot control, and the actions of others fall into that category. You can hope for understanding, but you cannot require it. You can wish for resolution, but you cannot wait for it endlessly, because while you wait, your life is paused. And once this becomes clear, something shifts. You begin to reclaim your attention. Your energy returns to the present. You are no longer checking, no longer expecting, no longer holding on to the possibility of something that is not happening. You begin to settle within yourself. There is also a release that comes from accepting that not every story ends neatly. Some things remain unfinished from the outside. Some questions remain unanswered. Some connections end without explanation, and that is part of life. But your peace does not have to remain unfinished. You can choose to complete it within yourself, to take what is clear, to accept what is not, and to stop waiting for something that is not required for your healing. Over time, this creates a deep sense of independence. You are no longer tied to someone else's actions. You are no longer waiting for permission to feel okay. You are grounded in your own understanding, your own clarity, your own decision to move forward. And slowly, the weight lifts. The situation no longer feels open. It becomes something that has ended, even if it did not end perfectly. The mind stops returning to it with expectation. It rests. This is the quiet power of self-closure. Not loud, not forced, but final. The understanding that your healing does not depend on someone else finishing the story. You have already done that for yourself. And as that waiting for closure begins to dissolve, another quiet weight becomes visible. Not tied to others this time, but tied to yourself, to choices you made, to moments you wish had gone differently, to paths you did not take. There is a kind of thinking that moves backward. The mind returns to the past, not to understand it, but to live inside it again. It replays decisions. It re-examines outcomes. It searches for the exact point where things could have changed. And the more it does this, the more it creates a version of life that feels better than the one that actually happened. This is regret. At first it feels like reflection, like you are learning, like you are gaining insight. But without awareness it becomes something else. It becomes a constant return to what cannot be undone. A quiet fixation on what should have been different. And over time it begins to damage the present, because while your body is here, your mind is somewhere else, in a moment that has already passed, in a decision that cannot be reversed, in a version of life that no longer exists. This is where regret turns into It takes your attention away from what is happening now. It replaces possibility with limitation. It fills the mind with a sense of loss, even when there is still so much available in the present. You begin to feel behind, stuck, as if something important has already been missed. There is also a deeper layer to regret. It often carries judgment, not just about the situation, but about yourself. You begin to question your past actions, your past thinking, your past decisions, and from that, a quiet dissatisfaction grows, a sense that you should have known better. But this perspective is incomplete, because it looks at the past with the knowledge of the present. It judges an earlier version of you with a level of awareness you did not have at the time, and in doing so, it creates an unfair comparison. The Stoics understood this clearly. They saw that regret, when misused, keeps the mind trapped, but when used correctly, it can become something else entirely, a source of wisdom. They did not ignore mistakes. They did not pretend everything was right, but they refused to live inside what had already passed. They extracted the lesson, and then they moved forward. This is the transformation. Instead of asking, "Why did I do that?" you begin to ask, "What did this teach me?" Instead of holding on to the mistake as something to carry, you turn it into something to use. This changes the direction of the mind. It no longer moves backward. It begins to move forward, guided by what has been learned. The past is no longer a place to live in, but a place to draw from. There is also a quiet acceptance that begins to form. The understanding that every decision you made came from the level of awareness you had at that time. You did not act with the clarity you have now, because that clarity did not exist yet. And once this is seen, the harsh judgment softens. You begin to relate to your past self with more understanding. Not to excuse everything, but to see it accurately. To recognize that growth is a process, and that mistakes are part of that process. The Stoics practiced this kind of reflection daily. They looked at their actions, saw where they could improve, and then adjusted. They did not carry the same regret into the next day. They used it, and then they released it. This preserves energy, because when regret is not held on to, it does not drain the present. It does not cloud your thinking. It does not take away from what you can still do now. And there is always something you can do now. This is where the real shift happens. You begin to see that the present is not defined by what happened before. It is shaped by what you choose to do with the understanding you have now. The past becomes a foundation, not a weight. And slowly, the need to revisit it fades. The mind becomes quieter. The constant comparison between what was and what could have been begins to dissolve. You are no longer living in a different version of your life. You are here. And in that presence, something returns. A sense of possibility, a sense of movement, a sense that your life is still unfolding, still open, still responsive to what you choose now. This is the quiet power of Stoic transformation. Not the removal of regret, but its redirection. The ability to turn what once felt like loss into something that guides you forward. And in that shift, something becomes clear. The past no longer poisons the present. It strengthens it. And as that grip of regret begins to loosen, another quiet pattern reveals itself. Not the pain you are trying to escape, but the part of you that has learned to stay inside it. The part that has become used to it. There is a strange kind of comfort in what is familiar, even when it hurts. Pain that has been carried for a long time begins to feel known, predictable, safe in a certain way. You understand it, you recognize it, you know how it feels, how it moves, how it shows up. And because of that, the mind begins to stay close to it, not because it wants to suffer, but because it fears what comes without it. This is where the trap forms. You begin to identify with the pain. It becomes part of your story, part of how you explain yourself, part of how you understand your past. And slowly, it starts to feel like something you cannot let go of, because you are not sure who you are without it. This is the false comfort. It feels stable, but it limits you. It feels familiar, but it holds you in place. You may begin to avoid situations that challenge this identity. You may resist change, not because you want to stay stuck, but because moving forward feels uncertain. Healing begins to feel unfamiliar. There is also a quiet fear underneath this. The fear that if you let go of the pain, you are dismissing what happened, that you are forgetting something important, that you are losing a part of your story. So you hold on, not tightly, not always consciously, but enough to keep it present, enough to keep it shaping how you see yourself. And over time, this becomes a kind of emotional habit. You return to the same feelings, the same thoughts, the same identity. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that while pain is part of life, staying inside it is a choice that can be changed. They did not deny what hurt them. They did not pretend wounds did not exist. But they refused to build their identity around those wounds. They chose to live beyond them. This requires courage, not the loud kind, but a quiet, steady courage. The willingness to step out of what is familiar, to allow yourself to experience something different, to accept that healing does not erase the past. It changes your relationship to it. There is a moment in this process where things feel uncertain. You are no longer fully inside the old identity, but you are not yet fully comfortable in a new one. The mind looks for something to hold on to, and the old pain is still there, familiar and easy to return to. But this is where the shift happens. Instead of going back, you stay present. You allow the discomfort of change. You allow the feeling of not fully knowing who you are without that old weight. And slowly, something new begins to form, a different sense of self, one that is not defined by past pain, one that is not built around what happened before, one that is grounded in what you are choosing now. This is where Stoic strength shows itself. The ability to face life as it is, without needing to hold on to old suffering as a reference point. The ability to carry your past without being carried by it. There is also a quiet freedom in letting go of the identity tied to pain. You are no longer limited by it. You are no longer viewing every situation through it. You begin to respond to life more directly, more openly, without the same filters. And with that, your experience changes. Not because life becomes perfect, but because you are no longer approaching it from a place of old wounds. You are present. You are aware. You are able to engage without being held back by something that no longer needs to define you. Over time, the familiarity of pain fades. Not completely, not instantly, but gradually. It loses its hold. It becomes something that belongs to the past, not something that shapes your present identity. And in its place, something steadier appears, a sense of self that is not dependent on suffering, a sense of direction that is not tied to old experiences, a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are not confined to what has already happened. This is the courage Stoicism offers, not the removal of pain, but the ability to live beyond it, the willingness to step out of what is familiar, even when it is uncomfortable, and move towards something clearer. And in that movement, something becomes possible again. You are no longer defined by what hurt you. You are defined by how you choose to move forward. And as that old identity begins to loosen, another force quietly takes its place. Not from the past this time, but from what has not yet happened. A subtle guarding, a constant scanning, a feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. There is a kind of fear that does not come from reality, but from anticipation. The mind begins to look ahead. It tries to prepare, to protect, to avoid future pain. And on the surface, this seems wise. It feels responsible, like you are staying alert, staying ready. But something happens beneath that. Instead of preparing, the mind begins to live inside those imagined outcomes. It builds scenarios. Things falling apart, people leaving, plans failing, loss appearing suddenly. And even though none of this is happening now, the body reacts as if it is close. This is how today begins to disappear. Because your attention is no longer here, it is somewhere ahead, trying to control something that does not exist yet. You are no longer experiencing the present. You are guarding against a future that may never come, and that constant guarding becomes exhausting. There is also a deeper reason why the mind does this. It believes that by anticipating pain, it can reduce its impact. That if it sees it early, thinks about it enough, prepares for it fully, it will not be caught off guard. But this is not what happens. The anticipation becomes its own form of suffering. You feel the tension now, the fear now, the pressure now, and if the imagined situation never happens, then all of that suffering was unnecessary. And if it does happen, you suffer twice, once in imagination and once in reality. This is the cost of anticipatory fear. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the mind often creates more suffering by trying to avoid it. So they practiced a different approach, not constant worry, but calm readiness. They did not ignore the possibility of difficulty. They acknowledged it. They prepared for it in a grounded, rational way. But they did not live inside it before it arrived. This is the difference. Preparation is clear and brief. It looks at what could happen, considers what can be done, and then returns to the present. Worry is endless. It repeats, expands, and keeps the mind locked in a future that is not real. The Stoics chose preparation, and then presence. They asked themselves, if something difficult happens, will I be able to respond? And the answer, through practice and discipline, became yes. Not because they could control everything, but because they trusted their ability to handle what comes. This builds a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence that nothing will go wrong, but the confidence that you will not collapse if it does. That whatever arises, you will meet it with clarity, with steadiness, with awareness. And once that trust is there, the need to constantly guard begins to fade. There is also a quiet release that comes from accepting uncertainty. Not trying to eliminate it, not trying to control every outcome, but recognizing that the future is not something to live inside before it arrives. It is something that unfolds, one moment at a time. And your role is not to predict it perfectly. Your role is to meet it when it comes. This brings your attention back to what is here, back to what is real, back to what can actually be experienced and acted upon. The mind no longer needs to stretch into imagined scenarios. It begins to settle into the present. And with that, something shifts. The tension softens. The constant alertness eases. The need to anticipate every possible outcome begins to quiet down. You are no longer trying to protect yourself from everything that might happen. You are simply here, ready but not afraid. This is the quiet strength of Stoic readiness. Not avoidance of pain, but the understanding that pain, if it comes, can be handled in its moment. That you do not need to suffer in advance, that you do not need to live in a future that has not arrived. And in that understanding, something becomes clear. Today is no longer being stolen, it is being lived. And as that constant guarding of the future begins to ease, another pattern quietly comes into view. Not fear this time, but avoidance. Not what you are afraid might happen, But what you already sense is true. There are things the mind knows, but does not want to face. A reality that feels uncomfortable, a truth that creates tension, something about your situation, your choices, your direction, that does not sit right. And instead of looking at it directly, the mind turns away. It softens it, it delays it, it distracts itself from it. This is denial. Not always obvious, not always intentional, but present. A quiet refusal to fully acknowledge what is already known, because facing it would require change, it would require discomfort, it would require letting go of something familiar. So the mind chooses distance. At first, this feels easier. You move on, you stay busy, you keep things light, and for a while it works. The tension fades into the background. The discomfort becomes less noticeable, but it does not disappear. It stays beneath the surface, and over time, that unaddressed truth begins to create something deeper. A quiet instability, a sense that something is off, even when everything appears fine. A subtle lack of clarity that affects your decisions, your focus, your sense of direction. This is the inner damage, not from the truth itself, but from avoiding it, because when you do not face what is real, the mind cannot organize itself properly. It cannot adjust. It cannot respond with clarity. It remains in a state of partial awareness, where something is known but not fully accepted, and that weakens it. There is also a cost in how you begin to see yourself. Each time you avoid something you know needs attention, a small gap forms between your awareness and your action. You know one thing, but you do another, and over time, that gap grows. This creates a loss of trust, not from others, but within yourself. A sense that you are not fully aligned, that you are not fully honest with your own experience, and this misalignment makes everything feel heavier. The Stoics understood this clearly. They believed that clarity is the foundation of peace, and clarity cannot exist without truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, even when it challenges what you want to believe. So they practiced confrontation, not aggressive, not forceful, but direct. They looked at reality as it was. They did not soften it to feel better. They did not avoid it to stay comfortable. They faced it fully with the intention of understanding and adjusting. This is where strength is built, because when you face a hard truth, something happens inside. The uncertainty reduces, the confusion clears. The mind no longer needs to carry the tension of avoidance. It can begin to organize itself around what is real. And from that clarity, action becomes possible. There is also a quiet relief in this process. The thing you were avoiding often feels heavier in the mind than it actually is in reality. The anticipation of facing it creates more tension than the act of facing it itself. And once you finally look at it directly, the weight begins to shift. It becomes something you can work with. The Stoics practiced this regularly. They examined their lives, their choices, their direction. They asked themselves what was true, not what was comfortable. And when something needed to change, they did not delay. They acted, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with clarity. And that clarity created a kind of peace that could not be shaken easily, because it was built on reality, not on avoidance. This is durable peace. Not a temporary calm that comes from distraction, but a steady state that comes from alignment. The alignment between what you see, what you accept, and how you act. There is no hidden tension, no unspoken truth waiting beneath the surface, no part of you that is being ignored. You are fully present with what is. And in that presence, something stabilizes. The mind becomes stronger. Not because life is easier, but because you are no longer avoiding it. You are engaging with it directly, with honesty, with clarity. And slowly, the inner damage begins to heal. Not through comfort, but through truth. Not through escape, but through confrontation. The understanding that facing what is real may be difficult in the moment, but it creates a foundation that lasts. And in that foundation, something becomes clear. Peace is not found by avoiding truth. It is built by facing it. And as that clarity with truth begins to settle, another quiet pattern comes into focus. Not what you are avoiding this time, but where your attention keeps going. How much of your mind is not with you, but with other people. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from physical effort. It comes from thinking about what someone said, thinking about how they feel about you, thinking about what they might be doing, what they might be thinking, what they might say next. And without realizing it, large parts of your mental space become occupied by others. This is where the drain begins, not because people are present, but because they are constantly present in your mind. You may notice how often your thoughts return to the same individuals, replaying conversations, analyzing behavior, predicting reactions. It feels like awareness, like you are trying to understand, to stay connected, to be prepared. But instead of clarity, it creates fatigue. Because your mind is working without rest, there is also a deeper cost to this habit. The more you focus on others, the less you remain with yourself. Your attention shifts outward constantly. Your sense of direction becomes influenced by what others are doing or might do. And slowly, your inner authority weakens. You begin to look outward for cues, for signs, for confirmation. Your thoughts revolve around others instead of your own path, and this creates a subtle loss of control, not in your actions, but in your attention. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that your attention is one of your most valuable resources. Where it goes determines the quality of your inner life. And when it is constantly placed on others, especially in ways you cannot control, it becomes scattered. So they practiced reclaiming it. Not by ignoring people, not by becoming distant, but by setting a clear boundary in the mind. They chose where their attention would go. They focused on what was within their control, their actions, their thoughts, their direction. This is where energy begins to return. When you are no longer thinking constantly about others, your mind becomes quieter. There is less repetition, less analysis, less unnecessary movement. You begin to feel more present, more grounded. There is also a shift in how you relate to others. You no longer carry them in your mind all the time. You engage when they are present, and then you return to yourself when they are not. You are not constantly checking, constantly analyzing, constantly anticipating. This creates space, and in that space, something important happens. You reconnect with your own thinking. Your own priorities become clearer. Your own direction becomes stronger. You are no longer being pulled in multiple directions by imagined scenarios involving others. You are centered again. This builds inner authority, not the kind that controls others, but the kind that governs your own mind. The ability to decide what deserves your attention and what does not. The discipline to bring your thoughts back when they drift unnecessarily. And this discipline changes everything. You begin to notice when your mind starts to move outward. The first thought about someone else, the first analysis, the first replay. And instead of following it, you pause. You recognize it as a pattern, not a necessity. You bring your attention back, not in a harsh way, but in a steady way, over and over until it becomes natural, until your mind no longer needs to occupy itself with others constantly. There is also a deeper understanding that supports this shift. Most of what you think about others is not accurate. It is interpretation. It is assumption. It is built from limited information. And even if it were accurate, it is not something you can control. So giving it constant attention does not serve you. The Stoics accepted this fully. They focused only on what they could influence directly, their actions, their responses, their inner state. Everything else was observed, but not carried. This preserved their energy. And as you begin to practice this, you feel the difference. The mind becomes lighter. The constant background thinking fades. You are no longer mentally occupied by people who are not even present. You are here with yourself, clear and focused. This is where real energy returns, not from doing less, but from thinking more deliberately, from choosing where your attention goes, from not allowing your mind to be consumed by things that do not require your involvement. And slowly, something shifts. You feel less drained, more stable, more in control of your own inner space. Not because others have changed, but because you are no longer giving them more space than they deserve. This is the quiet power of reclaiming your mind, the understanding that your attention belongs to you, and you can choose where it stays. And as you begin to reclaim your attention, another subtle habit comes into view. Not just thinking about others, but returning to yourself in a very specific way. Not to understand clearly, but to revisit what hurt again. There is a pattern the mind can fall into without noticing. It goes back to old wounds, not for healing, but for meaning. Moments that were painful, experiences that left a mark, situations that felt unfair or confusing. Instead of letting them settle, the mind keeps returning to them, searching for something deeper, a reason, a purpose, a sense of identity built around them. And slowly, pain becomes something you explore repeatedly, not because it still needs to be felt, but because it feels like it explains who you are. This is where the habit forms. You begin to look at your past, not just as something that happened, but as something that defines you. You revisit it to understand yourself, to shape your story, to give your life a certain meaning. And without realizing it, you start to build that meaning around the wound itself. This creates a quiet attachment. The pain becomes significant. It becomes central. It becomes something that feels important to hold on to. Because without it, there is a sense that something is missing, that your story loses depth or direction or identity. So the mind keeps returning. It reopens the same emotional spaces, touches the same memories, reflects on the same moments, not because they are still active, but because they feel meaningful. But this creates a problem, because meaning built only from pain becomes limiting. It narrows your sense of self. It keeps your identity tied to something that has already passed. It shapes how you see everything through the lens of what hurt you most. And over time, it becomes difficult to see beyond it. The Stoics understood that while pain can teach, it should not define. They did not deny difficult experiences. They examined them, learned from them, and then placed them in their proper place, as part of their past, not as the center of their identity. This is where a different kind of meaning begins. Instead of asking, "What does this pain say about me?" they asked, "What can I build from here?" They shifted the focus from the wound itself to the direction it could guide. This moves the mind forward. Meaning is no longer extracted from the pain alone. It is created through action, through choice, through how you live now. The past becomes a reference, not a foundation. There is also a quiet release in letting go of the need to revisit old wounds for significance. You do not lose your story. You expand it. You begin to see that who you are is not limited to what happened to you. It includes what you have chosen since then, the clarity you have gained, the direction you have taken, the way you have grown. This creates space. Space to see yourself beyond the wound. Space to experience life without constantly returning to the same place. space to build meaning in new ways, not tied to what hurt you. The Stoics practice this by focusing on what is within their control, not the past, not the events, not the wounds, but their present actions, their character, their decisions. They found meaning in how they lived, not just in what they had experienced. And this gave them freedom, because they were not bound to revisit their pain to feel significant. They were creating significance through their choices, moment by moment. Over time, this changes how the mind moves. It no longer feels the need to reopen old scars. It no longer searches for identity in past wounds. It begins to look forward, to build, to create, to live. And in that shift, something becomes lighter. The past loses its central role. It becomes one part of a larger story, not the defining piece. You are no longer returning to it for meaning. You are moving beyond it. This is the quiet power of Stoic perspective, the understanding that pain can teach you, but it doesn't have to define you. That meaning is not something you find only in what hurt you, but something you create in how you choose to live now. And in that creation, something becomes clear. You are more than your wounds. You always were. And as that attachment to old wounds begins to loosen, another pattern quietly reveals itself. Not the past this time, but how the mind reacts to what is happening now, especially when something small goes wrong. There are moments that should pass lightly. A delay, a mistake, a plan that does not work out, a comment that feels slightly off. On their own, these things are minor. They are part of life, temporary, manageable, not defining. But sometimes the mind does something different. It enlarges them. A small problem becomes something much bigger. A simple setback turns into a chain of negative thoughts. The mind begins to jump ahead, to connect one moment to many others, to build a story that stretches far beyond what is actually happening. And suddenly, something small feels overwhelming. This is how discomfort turns into catastrophe. It is not the event itself that creates the intensity. It is the interpretation. The way the mind reacts, the speed at which it expands the situation, the meaning it attaches to it. A single mistake becomes proof of failure. A small rejection becomes a sign of something deeper. A delay becomes a sense that everything is going wrong. And the body follows. Tension rises. Breathing changes. Focus narrows. The moment feels heavier than it should, not because it is, but because the mind has magnified it. This is what a fragile pattern looks like. Not weakness in character, but a lack of proportion. The inability to see things as they are without exaggeration. The tendency to let one moment define the whole. And over time, this creates instability, because life is full of small disruptions. If each one is treated as something major, the mind never settles. It stays in a constant state of reaction, moving from one heightened moment to the next. The Stoics understood this clearly. They trained themselves to maintain proportion. When something happened, they did not rush to label it as good or bad. They paused. They looked at it directly. They asked, what is this, really? Not what it feels like, not what it might become, but what it actually is in this moment. This slows everything down. Instead of reacting immediately, the mind begins to observe. The situation is seen more clearly without the added layers. A delay is just a delay. A mistake is just a mistake. It is not turned into something larger than it is. This restores balance. There is also a deeper practice involved. The Stoics prepared their minds for difficulty, not by expecting the worst constantly, but by accepting that setbacks are part of life, that things will not always go as planned. That discomfort is normal, and because they accepted this, they were less disturbed when it happened. The mind did not need to react as strongly. It was already aware that these moments exist. They were not surprises. They were expected parts of the path. This creates stability. You are no longer thrown off by every small disruption. You meet it with calm. You adjust. You move forward. The moment does not expand beyond what it is. There is also a shift in how you relate to discomfort itself. Instead of seeing it as something to avoid or fear, you begin to see it as something temporary, something that can be experienced without needing to escalate it, something that does not need to define the moment. This reduces its intensity. The mind becomes less reactive, more grounded. It does not jump to conclusions as quickly. It stays closer to what is real, what is present, what can actually be handled. And over time, this rebuilds strength. Not through force, but through clarity. The ability to see things in proportion, the ability to respond without exaggeration, the ability to remain steady even when things are not perfect. This changes everything. Small setbacks remain small. Discomfort passes more easily. The mind is not constantly creating larger problems out of smaller ones. It becomes more resilient, more stable, more capable of handling what comes, and slowly something shifts. The same situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. The same disruptions that once created tension begin to pass without much effect. Not because life has changed, but because your relationship to it has. This is the quiet strength of Stoic training, the ability to see clearly, to respond calmly, and to keep each moment in its proper place. And in that clarity, something becomes possible. You stop turning discomfort into catastrophe and start meeting life as it is. And as that sense of proportion begins to return, another pattern quietly steps forward. Not loud, not obvious, but deeply rooted. A feeling that seems soft on the surface, almost understandable, yet carries something heavier underneath. The feeling of self-pity. It often begins with something real, a difficult experience, an unfair situation, a moment where things did not go the way they should have, and naturally there is a reaction, a sense that you were wronged, that something about the situation was not right. At first, this is human, but when the mind stays there, something changes. The feeling begins to turn inward. It becomes a repeated focus on your own suffering, a quiet return to what happened, not to understand it, but to sit inside it, to feel it again, to confirm it, to remind yourself of how unfair it was. And slowly this becomes a pattern. You begin to see yourself through that lens, as someone who has been treated wrongly, as someone who has endured more than others, as someone whose pain holds a certain weight, and beneath that, something else forms, a subtle sense of identity. This is where self-pity becomes something more, because hidden inside it, there is a kind of pride. Not obvious, not spoken, but present. A feeling that your suffering sets you apart, that it gives your experience a certain depth, that it becomes part of how you see yourself in relation to others. This is ego in disguise, not the loud kind, not the kind that seeks superiority openly, but the kind that builds identity around being wronged, around carrying something heavier, something more difficult. And while it may feel justified, it creates a problem, because it keeps you in that position. The more you return to self-pity, the more you reinforce that identity. The more you see yourself as someone shaped by what happened to you, rather than someone who can move beyond it. This is where growth slows down, not because you are incapable, but because the mind has found something to hold on to, something that feels meaningful, even if it is painful. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that while pain is part of life, staying in a state of victimhood limits your ability to act. It keeps your focus on what was done to you instead of what you can do now. So they shifted the focus from what happened to how they respond. This is where responsibility begins. Not responsibility for everything that happened, but responsibility for your own state moving forward, your thoughts, your actions, your direction. This creates a different kind of strength. You are no longer defined by what went wrong. You are defined by how you choose to respond to it. You do not ignore the past, but you do not build your identity around it either. You move. There is also a quiet release in letting go of self-pity. Because it removes the need to keep returning to the same emotional space, it frees your attention from constant reflection on what was unfair. It allows you to step out of that role and into something more active, something more grounded. The Stoics practiced this by focusing on what was within their control, not the actions of others, not the fairness of every situation, but their own choices, their own mindset, their own ability to act with clarity, regardless of what had happened before. This creates movement. Instead of staying in a loop of reflection, you begin to take steps forward, small at first but real. You begin to build something new, not based on past pain, but based on present action. And in that movement, something changes. The need to hold on to the identity of being wronged begins to fade. Not because it was never true, but because it is no longer necessary. You are no longer using it as a reference point. You are creating a new one. There is also a deeper sense of freedom in this shift. You are no longer tied to a past event in the same way. You are no longer viewing yourself through the lens of what happened to you. You are seeing yourself through what you are choosing now, and that changes everything. This is the quiet transformation Stoicism offers. Not the denial of pain, but the refusal to let it define you. Not the rejection of emotion, but the redirection of it towards something constructive. And slowly something settles. You are no longer standing in self-pity. You are standing in responsibility. And from that place something becomes possible again. Forward movement. Not because life was always fair, but because you chose not to stay where it was not. And as that sense of responsibility begins to take root, another feeling quietly tries to take its place. Not self-pity this time, but something sharper, something that feels stronger, more controlled, more justified. Bitterness. It often grows from the same place, from what was unfair, from what was taken, from what did not go as it should have. But instead of turning inward with sadness, it turns outward with hardness. It feels like strength. There is a certain energy to it, a sense that you are no longer vulnerable, that you see things clearly now, that you are no longer naive, no longer open in the same way. It can feel like you have learned your lesson, but something about it is heavy, because bitterness does not release the past. It carries it. It holds on to the same events, the same people, the same experiences, but instead of pain, it wraps them in resistance, in judgment, in a quiet refusal to soften. And over time, this becomes a state. You may begin to notice how your thinking changes, how you expect less from people, how you assume negative intentions more quickly, how you close off before something even has the chance to unfold. This is not clarity. This is protection taken too far. Bitterness imitates strength because it removes vulnerability. It builds walls. It creates distance. It gives the feeling that nothing can reach you in the same way again. But in doing so, it also removes something else. Openness. The ability to experience life without constant resistance. The ability to connect without carrying past judgments into every new interaction. The ability to move forward without being shaped by what hurt you before. This is the hidden cost. Because while bitterness may protect you from being hurt in the same way, it also limits your experience. It narrows your perspective. It keeps your inner world tied to past events, even as time moves on. And slowly it begins to weaken you. Not in a visible way, but internally. The constant tension, the quiet negativity, the lack of ease. It builds over time, creating a state where peace becomes difficult to access. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that true strength is not found in hardness, but in clarity. Not in resisting everything, but in responding with balance. They did not allow themselves to become bitter, because they saw that it distorts perception. It makes you see the present through the past. So they practiced purification of the inner life, not through denial, but through examination. When bitterness began to form, they looked at it directly. They asked, "What am I holding on to? What am I resisting? What part of this am I continuing to carry?" This creates awareness, and with awareness, the grip begins to loosen. There is also a deeper understanding that shifts how you see the situation. What happened has already happened. The person acted as they did. The event unfolded as it did. Holding on to bitterness does not change that. It only changes your present state. And once this is seen clearly, something begins to release. You realize that carrying bitterness is a choice. Not always an easy one to change, but a pattern that can be adjusted. You begin to see that letting go does not mean approving what happened. It means freeing yourself from its ongoing effect. The Stoics practiced this through acceptance and redirection. They accepted that not everything would be fair, that people would act in ways that are difficult, confusing, even harmful. But they refused to let those actions shape their inner world long term. They chose to remain steady. This does not remove all reaction, but it softens it. It prevents it from becoming a permanent state. It allows you to experience what happened, learn from it, and then return to a balanced way of seeing. There is also a quiet strength in this balance. You are not closed off, you are not hardened, but you are clear. You see situations as they are, without adding layers of resistance. You respond without carrying the same weight forward. And over time, this changes how you feel. The heaviness begins to lift. The constant tension fades. The need to protect yourself through hardness weakens. You begin to feel more open, more at ease, more present. Not because life is easier, but because you are no longer holding on to what has already passed. This is the quiet purification Stoicism offers. Not the removal of difficulty, but the removal of unnecessary weight. The ability to let go of what no longer serves you, even if it once felt justified. And in that release, something becomes clear. Bitterness was never strength. It was a burden. And once it is set down, you feel lighter. And as that bitterness begins to fade, another quiet pattern starts to reveal itself. Not how you react to others, but how much of yourself you give to them. How available you are, not just in action, but emotionally. There is a habit that feels generous on the surface. You respond quickly, you listen often, you show up when needed, you make space for others, even when you are already full. It feels like care. It feels like connection. It feels like being a good person. But over time, something begins to shift. You start to feel drained, not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are giving without limit. Your attention is constantly pulled outward. Your energy is divided across too many people, too many situations, too many emotional demands, and slowly your own stability begins to weaken. This is the emotional cost of being too available. When there are no clear boundaries, everything becomes urgent. Every message needs a reply. Every problem needs your attention. Every feeling from others becomes something you carry. And without noticing, your inner space becomes crowded. There is little room left for stillness, little time to return to yourself. Little space to process your own thoughts, your own emotions, your own direction. You are present for everyone, except yourself. This creates imbalance, because your energy is finite, your attention is limited, and when it is constantly extended outward without discipline, it begins to wear you down, not all at once, but gradually. You may notice it in small ways: less patience, more mental noise, a sense of pressure that is hard to explain, a feeling that you are always slightly overwhelmed, even when nothing major is happening. This is not because life is too much. It is because you are carrying too much. The Stoics understood this clearly. They saw that attention is a resource that must be managed, not withheld completely, not given endlessly, but directed with intention. They practiced what can be called emotional economy, the careful use of inner energy. They did not give their attention to everything. They chose where it was needed, where it was useful, where it aligned with their values. And once that attention was given, they did not extend beyond what was necessary. This created balance. They were present when needed, but they were not constantly available. They cared, but they did not absorb every situation. They engaged, but they returned to themselves afterward. This is where stability is built. When you begin to set boundaries, not in a harsh way, but in a clear way, something changes. You start to protect your attention. You become more selective about where your energy goes. You respond, but you do not overextend. You listen, but you do not carry everything. You show up, but you do not abandon yourself in the process. This is not selfishness. It is clarity. Because without boundaries, your ability to care weakens over time. You become exhausted, distracted, less present, and the quality of your attention decreases, even if the quantity remains high. But with discipline, your attention becomes stronger, more focused, more intentional, more grounded. There is also a deeper shift that comes with this. You begin to respect your own limits. You no longer feel the need to be everywhere, to fix everything, to respond to everything immediately. You understand that your energy must be preserved in order to be used well, and this creates calm. Your mind is no longer pulled in multiple directions at once. You are not constantly reacting to external demands. You are moving with intention, choosing where to engage and where to step back. This builds inner stability. You feel more centered, more present, more in control of your own space. Not because others have changed, but because you have changed how you respond. The Stoics practiced this by focusing on what truly mattered. They did not waste energy on things outside their control. They did not give equal attention to everything. They prioritized clarity, purpose, and inner balance. And in doing so, they preserved their strength. Over time, this changes how you experience your relationships. They become lighter, more natural, less demanding. You are not overwhelmed by them. You are present within them without losing yourself. And slowly the exhaustion fades, not because you are doing less, but because you are doing it with intention. Your energy is no longer scattered. It is directed. This is the quiet power of disciplined emotional economy, the understanding that your attention is valuable and that it must be used wisely. And in that understanding, something settles. You are no longer stretched thin. You are standing whole. And as those boundaries begin to take shape, another quiet tension comes into view. Not just how much you give, but what you expect in return. Not attention this time, but understanding. There is a deep desire many people carry, to be seen clearly, to be understood exactly as they are, to have someone grasp not just their words, but their intentions, their feelings, their inner world, without distortion. And when that happens, even briefly, it feels like relief, like something inside has settled. But when it does not happen, something else follows. A quiet frustration, a feeling of being misread, a sense that something important about you is not being seen correctly. And without realizing it, the mind begins to react. It explains more. It clarifies again. It replays the conversation. It searches for a way to make itself understood perfectly. And slowly this becomes a burden, because perfect understanding is rare. Every person sees through their own lens, their own experiences, their own assumptions, their own limitations. No matter how clearly you speak, there will always be some difference in how it is received. And when your peace depends on being fully understood, it becomes unstable. You begin to carry the weight of explanation constantly. You feel the need to correct every misunderstanding, to adjust every perception, to make sure nothing about you is misinterpreted. And this creates pressure, not just in communication, but inside your own mind. Because you are no longer just expressing yourself. You are managing how you are understood. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that while communication matters, it has limits. You can speak with honesty, you can act with clarity, but you cannot control how others interpret you. And trying to do so leads to exhaustion. So they practiced something different. They focused on being clear within themselves, not perfectly understood by others, but aligned within. They spoke what was true, acted with intention, and then allowed the outcome to be what it was. This is where peace begins to form. When you no longer require perfect understanding, something relaxes. The pressure to explain everything fades. The need to control how you are seen begins to soften. You become lighter. There is also a deeper acceptance that supports this shift. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone will see your intentions the way you do. Not everyone will interpret your actions accurately. And this is not something to fix completely. It is part of being human. Once this is accepted, something changes. You no longer feel the need to chase understanding. You express yourself, and then you let go. You allow space for difference. You allow room for misinterpretation without feeling the need to correct it immediately. This creates freedom. You are no longer tied to every reaction. You are no longer adjusting your inner state based on how well you are understood. You remain grounded, even when others do not see things clearly. This builds a quiet confidence, not in being right, but in being aligned. The sense that you know where you stand, regardless of how it is perceived. The ability to hold your position without needing constant validation through understanding. And over time, this changes how you communicate. You become more direct, more simple, more at ease. You say what needs to be said without adding layers of explanation. You trust that your clarity is enough. And if it is not received perfectly, you do not carry that as a burden. You allow it to pass. The Stoics practiced this kind of detachment not out of indifference, but out of wisdom. They knew that trying to control perception is endless work, and that peace is found not in perfect communication, but in inner alignment. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop depending. You still value connection. You still value understanding. But you do not require it in order to feel stable. You do not place your peace in something that cannot be fully controlled. And slowly, the burden lifts. The constant need to explain fades. The frustration of being misunderstood softens. The mind becomes quieter, more grounded, less reactive. You are no longer chasing clarity from others. You are resting in your own. And in that rest, something becomes clear. You do not need to be perfectly understood to be at peace. And as that need to be understood begins to quiet down, something deeper comes into view. Not how others see you, but how you see yourself. The story you carry, the way you define who you are. There is a subtle pattern the mind falls into after something painful happens. A betrayal, a loss, a moment of humiliation, something that cuts deeply enough to leave a mark. At first, it is just an experience, something that happened, something that hurt, something that stays in memory. But over time, something changes. The mind begins to build a story around it, not just remembering the event, but using it as a reference point, as a way to explain things, as a way to understand yourself. And slowly, that one moment starts to take up more space than it should. It begins to define you. You may notice how often your thoughts return to it, how it influences how you see new situations, how it shapes your expectations, your reactions, your sense of what is possible. It becomes a lens through which everything else is viewed, and without realizing it, your identity begins to shrink. Because one moment, no matter how intense, is not the whole of you. But when it is repeated often enough, it starts to feel like it is. It becomes the central point, the defining experience, the thing that explains everything else. This is the damage, not just the pain of the event itself, but the way it is allowed to shape your entire story. It limits how you see yourself. It reduces your complexity to a single experience. It keeps you tied to something that has already passed. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that while painful moments are part of life, they do not define the whole. They are events, not identities. They are experiences, not the essence of who you are. So they practiced widening their view. Instead of focusing on one moment, they looked at the larger picture, their actions over time, their character, their choices, the way they responded, the way they continued, the way they moved forward. This creates a different perspective. You begin to see that your life is not a single event. It is a series of actions, decisions, responses. It is something that continues to unfold, and no single moment has the power to define it completely, unless you allow it to. There is also a quiet release in stepping back from that one story. You do not deny that it happened. You do not pretend it did not matter, but you place it in context. You see it as part of your experience, not the center of it. This expands your sense of self. You begin to notice other parts of your life, other strengths, other moments, other directions. You are no longer confined to that one event. You are able to see yourself more fully. And with that, something shifts. The emotional weight begins to spread out. It is no longer concentrated in one place. The identity that was built around that moment begins to loosen. You are no longer defined by it in the same way. The Stoics practiced this by focusing on what they could control moving forward. They did not stay fixed on what had already happened. They asked, what can I do now? How can I act with clarity? How can I live in a way that reflects my values, regardless of the past? This creates movement. Instead of being anchored to a single moment, you begin to build a broader story. One that includes growth, change, resilience. One that is not limited to what hurt you, but includes what you have done since. And over time, this changes how you feel. The past becomes less dominant. The same memory may still exist, but it no longer defines everything. It becomes one part of a larger picture. A picture that continues to grow. There is also a deeper understanding that comes with this shift. You are not a single moment. You are not the worst thing that happened to you. You are not the most painful experience you have had. You are the one who continues beyond it, the one who acts, who chooses, who moves forward. This is where real identity begins, not in what happened, but in how you live now. And as this becomes clear, something settles. The story expands, the weight lifts, the mind becomes less confined. You are no longer standing inside that one moment. You are standing beyond it, and in that space, something becomes possible again. A life that is larger than what hurt you. And as that larger view of yourself begins to settle, another quiet disturbance starts to reveal itself. Not tied to the past this time, but to the absence of something in the present. Direction. There is a kind of noise that grows when the mind has nowhere clear to go. At first, it does not seem connected. You may just notice more thinking, more drifting thoughts, more questions that do not lead anywhere. The mind jumps from one thing to another, revisiting small concerns, creating new ones, then abandoning them. It feels restless. This is not because there is too much happening, but because there is not enough clarity guiding what matters. When there is no direction, the mind fills the space. It creates problems to solve. It replays conversations. It searches for something to hold on to, and without realizing it, your inner world becomes crowded with unnecessary movement. This is mental noise. Not useful thinking, not focused reflection, but scattered activity. Thoughts that do not lead to action, concerns that do not require attention, questions that do not have clear purpose. And over time, this creates anxiety. Because the mind is active, but not anchored. There is energy, but no direction for it to flow. And when energy has no direction, it begins to turn inward in unhelpful ways. It loops, it expands small things. It creates tension out of nothing. This is where emotional instability begins to grow. Not from external pressure, but from internal disorganization. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that the mind needs purpose, not just in a large, distant sense, but in a daily, practical way. A clear sense of what matters, what deserves attention, what direction your actions are moving toward. Without that, the mind drifts. So they practiced intentional living. Each day they defined what they would focus on, what actions aligned with their values, what mattered in that moment. This created structure, not rigid, but clear, and that clarity organized the mind. When you know what matters, your attention becomes more selective. You do not follow every thought. You do not engage with every concern. You return to what is relevant, what is useful, what is aligned with your direction. This reduces noise. There is also a deeper effect of purpose. It gives meaning to your actions. When your actions are connected to something clear, even small tasks feel grounded. They are not random. They are part of a direction. And because of that, the mind becomes more stable. It has something to return to. Instead of drifting into endless thinking, it moves toward action. Instead of creating unnecessary problems, it engages with what is real. Instead of collapsing inward, it moves outward with intention. This creates calm. Not because there are no thoughts, but because the thoughts are organized. They are connected to something. They have a place, a direction, a purpose. The Stoics did not wait for a grand purpose to appear. They built it through their actions. They focused on what they could control, acting with discipline, speaking with honesty, responding with clarity. These small, consistent choices created a sense of direction that stabilized their inner world. And over time, this becomes natural. You begin to notice when your mind starts to drift, when thoughts become scattered, when attention becomes loose. And instead of following that pattern, you return to your direction. You ask, what matters right now? And you act. This simple shift changes everything. The noise begins to fade. The constant mental movement slows down. You are no longer lost in endless thinking. You are grounded in purposeful action. There is also a quiet confidence that comes from this. You are not reacting to every thought. You are choosing where your energy goes. You are directing your attention instead of being pulled by it. This builds inner strength, and slowly the anxiety begins to soften. Not because life is perfect, but because your mind is no longer disorganized. It has structure, it has clarity, it has direction. And in that direction, something settles. You are no longer drifting inside your own thoughts. You are moving with intention, and that is where peace begins to take shape. And as that sense of direction begins to steady the mind, another force quietly tries to take control. Not from the past, not from the future, but from within the present moment itself. Your emotions. There is a subtle shift that happens when emotions are left unexamined. They begin as signals, small movements inside you, a reaction to something that happens, a change in energy, in mood, in feeling. But when they are not observed, they begin to lead. A small irritation turns into a full reaction. A brief sadness becomes a heavy state. A moment of frustration shapes your entire day. And without realizing it, your life begins to move according to these shifting feelings. This is the invisible tyranny. Not loud, not obvious, but powerful. Because it feels natural. It feels like you are simply responding to how you feel. But what is actually happening is something deeper. You are being led. Your decisions, your actions, your tone, your focus, all begin to follow whatever emotion is strongest in the moment. And because emotions change quickly, your direction changes with them. This creates instability. You may start the day with clarity, but one interaction shifts your mood and everything else follows. Plans change, focus breaks, reactions increase. And at the end, you are left wondering why things feel so scattered. It is not because you lack ability. It is because you are not leading your inner state. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that emotions are not enemies, but they are not meant to be rulers either. They are responses, not commands. They provide information, but they do not determine action unless you allow them to. So they trained themselves to pause. When an emotion appeared, they did not immediately act on it. They observed it. They gave it space without giving it control. They asked, "What is this feeling? What is it responding to? Is it accurate? Is it useful?" This creates distance. And in that distance, something important happens. You regain control. The emotion is still there. It has not been denied, not been suppressed, but it is no longer driving your behavior. You are now choosing how to respond instead of reacting automatically. This is where inner leadership begins. You are no longer pushed around by every mood. You are not shifting direction with every feeling. You are steady, even when emotions move. There is also a deeper understanding that supports this. Emotions are temporary. They rise, they peak, they pass. But when you act on them immediately, you extend their impact. You turn something brief into something lasting. You give them more power than they naturally have. The Stoics recognized this. They allowed emotions to pass without attaching action to them. They let the wave rise and fall, without trying to control it, but also without letting it control them. This builds discipline. Not harsh control, not suppression, but calm awareness. The ability to feel without being carried away. The ability to respond with clarity, even when the inner state is unsettled. And over time, this changes everything. You begin to notice your patterns, the moments where you would have reacted before, the situations where your mood would have taken over. And instead of following that pattern, you pause, you choose. This creates stability. Your actions become more consistent. Your decisions become clearer. Your life is no longer shaped by passing emotional states, but by deliberate response. There is also a quiet confidence that grows from this. You trust yourself more, not because you control every feeling, but because you know you will not be controlled by them. You can experience whatever arises without losing your direction. And slowly, the tyranny fades. The emotions are still there, but they no longer rule. They move through you, not over you. They inform, but they do not command. This is the quiet power of Stoic training, the ability to let the mind lead and the emotions follow. And in that order, something settles. You are no longer reacting to life, you are responding to it. And that changes everything. And as that inner leadership begins to take shape, another pattern quietly reveals itself. Not the emotions themselves this time, but the constant readiness for something to go wrong. A subtle tightening inside, a habit of staying guarded even when nothing is happening. There is a way of living where you are always slightly on edge. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. You scan conversations. You read between lines. You prepare responses before they are needed. You hold back parts of yourself just in case, just to stay safe. At first, this feels wise. It feels like awareness, like you are protecting yourself from being caught off guard, from being hurt again, from repeating something you have already experienced. But over time, something begins to change. The guard never drops. Even in calm moments, even with familiar people, even when there is no real threat, the mind remains in a state of defense, and this constant tension begins to take a toll. This is the long damage, not from one event, but from living as if every moment requires protection. Your body carries it, your thoughts reflect it, your energy slowly drains from it. Because staying guarded is effort. It requires attention. It requires control. It requires holding back, filtering, preparing. And when this becomes constant, it creates exhaustion. Not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from never fully relaxing. There is also a deeper effect. When you are always in defense, you are never fully present. You are not meeting the moment as it is. You are meeting it as it might become. You are anticipating, adjusting, protecting, and in doing so, you miss something: ease. The ability to exist without tension, the ability to engage without constant calculation, the ability to move through life without feeling like something needs to be managed at all times. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that constant defense is not strength, it is strain. It keeps the mind in a state of alertness that is not always necessary. And over time, that strain weakens your inner stability. So they practice something different. Grounded alertness. Not careless openness, not blind trust, but a calm readiness that does not require tension. A state where you are aware, but not guarded. Present, but not defensive. This is the difference. Defense assumes danger is always near. Alertness recognizes that it may come, but does not live as if it already has. This creates space. You are no longer tightening in every moment. You are no longer preparing for outcomes that are not happening. You are simply here, aware of what is real, not what is imagined. There is also a deeper trust that supports this shift. The understanding that if something difficult does arise, you will be able to respond, that you do not need to stay in constant protection mode to be capable, that your strength lies in your ability to meet situations as they come, not in anticipating all of them. This reduces the need for defense. You begin to relax into the present, not completely unaware, but not overly guarded either. You are open enough to experience and steady enough to respond if needed. This is balance. The Stoics practiced this by focusing on what was within their control. They did not try to control every possible outcome. They did not stay in constant preparation. They grounded themselves in their own clarity, their own discipline, their own ability to act when necessary, and this gave them peace. because they were not living in reaction to imagined threats. They were living in alignment with what was real. Over time, this changes how you feel. The tension begins to soften. The constant alertness fades into something calmer. You are no longer scanning every moment for signs of danger. You are present, steady, at ease. Not because life is always safe, but because you are no longer carrying unnecessary defense. There is also a quiet energy that returns. When the mind is not constantly guarding, it has more space, more clarity, more focus. You feel less drained, less tight, less burdened by the need to protect yourself at all times. And slowly, something shifts. You begin to experience moments fully again. Conversations without overthinking, silence without tension, presence without preparation. This is the quiet strength of grounded alertness, the ability to be aware without being exhausted by it. And in that state, something becomes clear. You do not need to live in constant defense to be safe. You only need to be ready when it truly matters. And now, as all of this begins to settle, something quiet becomes clear. You were never broken. You were just carrying too much for too long, without being shown how to put it down. Every loop, every fear, every replayed memory, every need for validation, every moment of doubt. It was not weakness. It was a mind trying to protect itself without the right tools. But now you've seen something different. You've seen how thoughts don't have to control you, how the past doesn't have to define you, how emotions don't have to lead you, how other people don't get to decide your peace. And more importantly, you've seen that freedom is not something you wait for. It's something you practice, quietly, daily, moment by moment. Not by becoming someone new, but by returning to who you were before the noise took over. So tonight, don't try to fix everything. Just let it go, one layer at a time. And if even one part of this spoke to you, if something inside you felt lighter, clearer, or more still, write in the comments, "I'm taking my mind back." That one sentence is not just a comment. It's a decision. And if you're ready to keep building that kind of inner strength, slowly, quietly, powerfully, subscribe to the channel and stay close, because this isn't just content, it's your return to peace.